It was a sunny September morning when we heard on the wireless that we were at war. For weeks everyone had felt it coming. The air was heavy with expectation, rather like when a thunderstorm is building up and you wait for the first crack of thunder. But now the waiting was over. The war had started, and I think we were ready for it. So when about 2 minutes later the air raid siren sounded, we knew just what to do. It was a Sunday morning, and I was at home with my mother and father and 2 sisters. We went down into the cellar and sealed round the edges of the door with brown sticky paper. The Germans, of course, would be using poison gas on us. We sat and waited. Then someone realized that the dog was still outside, so we unstuck the door and brought him down. I forget how long we stayed there, but eventually a radio announcement told us that it had been a false alarm. An unscheduled plane had apparently flown in over Norfolk, and that was all it was. Next day, they were calling for volunteers to start digging air raid trenches in Hyde Park. I'd recently been in hospital with a partially detached retina in one of my eyes, and I thought I ought not yet to start digging. But on the Wednesday, I joined up. They'd opened recruiting centres in the main London stations, and I joined the back of the queue in Victoria Station. I was wanting to get into the Navy, but word came back down the queue that there was a 6-month waiting list for the Navy, and I thought the war might be over before I could get started. So when I heard the man in front of me ask to join the RASC and saw him accepted, I told the recruiting sergeant that I too wanted to get to the RASC. I hadn't the vaguest idea as what the letter stood for, but the formula worked. The man at the trestle table gave me 2 shillings and told me to report back there at 8 o'clock. That was it. I was in. I later learned that I joined the Royal Army Service Corps. So I went home, put a few things into a suitcase, kissed everyone goodbye, and returned to Victoria Station. They herded us all together and took us to Waterloo Station, where they put us on a train for Aldershot. There was blackout everywhere now, of course, so when we got to Aldershot and were shown into the barrack room, we almost had to grope to find our beds. These, I noted, were all about 4 feet long. Next day, it turned out that the bottom half of the bed slid under the top half to be pulled out at night, that the 3 small mattresses they gave us, each about 30 inches square, could be spread out to make a fairly comfortable bed. But I was tired, and I thought that if the army liked its beds half-size, I'd better start getting used to it. So I curled up on this half-bed and went to sleep. My mind's a blank about what happened in the next few days, but I do know that within a fortnight we were on our way to France. They'd issued us with rifles, but hadn't told us how to use them. The rifles, I remember, were heavily greased and in need of a clean. Anyhow, there we were, on board ship, off to win the war. In France, they put us on a train, and we travelled all through the night. On one occasion, the train pulled up, and some women came round with hot, spiced wine, which made us feel vaguely heroic. After all, we were on our way to die for our country. When it was daylight, we found that the train had stopped at the station, so we got out and found we were at a place called Le Mans. There was a large map of France on the platform, and we all crowded round it, trying to find out where we were. We searched the Belgian border and the eastern frontier. We'd come to fight the Germans, so we supposed we must be somewhere near the German border. Suddenly, there was a cry from the other end of the map. Le Mans was right in the west of France, miles away from the Germans, so there was no immediate prospect of death and glory. This cheered us up a lot. Eventually, we came to La Baule, which was a holiday resort in South Brittany on the north coast of the Bay of Biscay. As we drove through the town in our open trucks, the girls were all lining the streets, waving at us and blowing us kisses. We almost felt we'd won the war already. We drove through the town to the hotel which had been requisitioned for our use. I was taken upstairs and along dark corridors to my room. They threw open the shutters and I looked out on the bay, bathed in sunlight. What a way to start the war. There were 4 of us RASC privates in our office, and I don't remember what we were meant to be doing, but I can't think there could have been very much to do anyhow. Postage was free for those on active service, so I used to spend my days learning to type on a massive old Olivetti, sending letters to all my friends at home, telling them how the war was going. We had good fun in that office. It's marvelous how young people manage to enjoy themselves in just about any situation. I remember we put up a notice on the wall, clock watchers don't win wars. One day they came round asking if anyone could speak French, and since another lad called Henry White and I said we could, we were detailed off to join a new section they were starting, the Central Purchase Control Board. Its function would be to supervise or arrange the purchase of French goods for the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, of which we were part. The new section consisted, I think, of a full colonel, a major, 2 captains, a warrant officer, class 1, and us 2 privates to make the tea. One of the captains had been working in France before the war and seemed to do most of the work. They set up the office in a little village called Gouy-en-Artois, in the northeast of France, in the Pas-de-Calais. White and I were billeted in a cottage with some men from the Inniskillings. I never lived among men like this before, and it was a great thrill to discover that I got on all right with them, and that they accepted me, even though I felt so much younger than they were. In the loft of the cottage, one of them found a British bayonet that must have been left there after World War I. Charming as the Inniskillings were, White and I had no mind to spend our evenings in their company, so we approached a woman in a farmhouse and asked her if she had a room she could lend us. She showed us an outhouse with a stove in it, and it was there that we went every evening to cook our supper. The family was called Roy de Latre, and I got very friendly with them. One day I remember I was helping Monsieur, I think he was called Emile, to lift some sugar beet, when suddenly his massive cart horse heeled right over and fell on the ground unconscious. Apparently this was routine. He got out a sort of chisel, punched a hole in the horse's neck so that the blood spurted out, and after a short time the horse came to and got up, and we carried on. There was a system then in France of some soldiers on active service having a marraine de guerre, a war godmother. Women, who had no son or husband in the services, would adopt a soldier and keep him supplied with socks and cigarettes and so on. So Madame Leroy adopted me as a filleule de guerre. There was no material side to this apart from her hospitality, but it created a very happy relationship. And when I wrote to her after the war, I would always sign myself her affectionate filleule. She had 2 small children of her own, a boy and a girl. In December that year, that is, 1939, the Central Purchase Control Board moved to Paris. We were billeted in an hotel near the Gare du Nord, and I had to share a room with another private, a poor man with smelly feet. Not ordinary smelly feet, but the sort you can already smell on the landing below as you came upstairs. I'm sure there must be some sort of cure for that sort of affliction, but perhaps he was not aware he had anything wrong with him, and people had been too kind to tell him. Being in uniform in wartime Paris gave one certain privileges. There was a canteen in the Gare du Nord where we could have dinner every day for about 6pence, and for the same price we could get a seat at the opera and in concerts. So once a week I'd be going to the opera, and once to the Opera Comique, and occasionally to a concert. I remember at one concert there was the first performance of something which, to my Philistine ears, sounded pretty awful. The composer was there, and when it ended and the applause began, everyone was turned towards him, beaming their admiration and clapping for all they were worth. Eventually, the clapping died out, and in the ensuing silence, there was a sudden loud cry. Horrible, well, horrible it was in French, of course. It was marvelous. There was a moment of stunned horror, and then the applause broke out again, fiercer than ever. I was glad that there was at least one person in the audience who shared my Philistine taste. On one occasion, I remember, I was walking along and was stopped by another British soldier coming the other way. He looked anxious and asked me where the brothels were. I wasn't able to help him. I didn't even know the French word for brothel to help him in his search. Poor fellow. As the months went by, the scene shifting in the opera house became markedly slower and noisier. I went to the last one there on the Saturday before the Germans came in. It was La Flûte Enchantée, and there was something quite pathetic about those long, noisy, between-scene pauses. I may say that during those months we had no Wagner. I bought a bicycle and used to cycle around the central part of the city in the evenings, admiring its beauty. The most beautiful spot, I decided, was at a table outside a cheap little cafe on the left bank where I used to go for supper. It was almost opposite Notre Dame, and to see the flying buttresses rising out of the chestnut trees in flower was a pure delight. As I sat there and watched the moon come up and bathe the cathedral in its light, it was easy to forget that there was a war on at all. In fact, I once did, and got back to my hotel to find everyone very worked up, because I had left the light on in my room with no blackout. On Sundays, I used to go to the Embassy Chapel for morning service, and the chaplain invited me round one evening for a meal. He was very kind and did most of the talking. In those days, I was extremely shy, and it must have been heavy work entertaining me. But when I got home from visiting him, I felt strangely dissatisfied, and it wasn't until some time later that I realized just why. I wanted to talk about God, and didn't know how to start. Those months in Paris were, for me, a time of spiritual disquiet. I remember kneeling down at my bed one night, begging God to give me either life or death, either death in the war or a life that I knew I somehow lacked. What I needed, I suppose, was confession, or at least a good act of contrition. But all I knew at the time was that I was very uncomfortable with myself and didn't know what to do about it. In J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, you may remember the little boy wanted his nose blowing. This was something he'd never done on his own. All he knew was that he was uncomfortable and that things were not as they should be. When I was with a chaplain, I really wanted to talk about God, but he gave me no opening. We just talked about this and that. So I returned home as heavy-hearted as I'd come. In those days, we always had to keep our gas masks with us, but life was leisurely in Paris, and in the hot weather, instead of the gas mask, I used to keep bathing trunks and a towel in my gas mask case. I fear I'm giving a wrong impression of life in Paris, as though I had nothing to do but go to the opera and enjoy myself. In fact, of course, we had to go to the office every day, and we had our hours of duty. I would sweep the place out and keep it clean, and in general try to be an obliging office boy. When I was on duty and the phone rang, I would pick it up and say, "Central Purchase Control Board," in what I thought was a suitably harsh manner. I used to get quite a kick out of the courtesy with which senior officers, the other end of the line, would address me. They wouldn't know I was just a private, but they did want something out of our office, so they were very polite. If they were French, I'd say, "Ici l'armée britannique," in my awful English accent. I reckon this would help our war effort too. I remember that in that first year of the war, we bought up all the available champagne there was in France for use in our hospitals. I believed that story then. I think I believe it now. Champagne, apparently, is a great pick-you-up. Well, all good things come to an end, and so did the phony war, as it was called. I was told that our military attaché was having breakfast in his hotel one morning, when a man at the next table said to him, "Well, it's started," and showed him the headlines in his paper. The poor military attaché leapt up and rushed to his office. It turned out that the clerk on duty had indeed received a telegram in the course of the night, but hadn't thought to do anything about it. So, on the Monday after that last La Flûte Enchantée, we left Paris, and the Germans arrived on the Wednesday. As we drove away from our hotel, the concierge stood weeping on the pavement, and little boys threw stones at us. This was in mid-June 1940. We were not the only ones to be heading westward from Paris. I remember long lines of slowly moving traffic, all trying to get as far away from the Germans as they could. On the inside lane there were farm carts drawn by horses, piled high with household goods. In the middle lane there were mainly army vehicles. The outside lane was for oncoming traffic and was empty, except once when a car pulled out of our lane and tried to race ahead. Someone opened up on it with a machine gun and it pulled back into line. A very effective way of dealing with road hogs. We came to Le Mans, and our colonel tried to set up office there. But he must have received orders to leave the country, and we continued our journey to Saint-Nazaire. White and I queued up to embark on the Lancaster, but when I was about to board, we were told that the ship was now full, and we'd have to go on the next ship. I was later told that the Germans sank the Lancaster with a bomb down the funnel. We embarked on what must have been some sort of warship, because there turned out to be an anti-aircraft gun right next to the place on the deck where I was trying to get some sleep. It woke me up, of course, when they started firing it, and I sat up, but this was just as well, because our warrant officer had been looking for me. Our colonel was the senior officer on board, so he was automatically OC ship, and our warrant officer was in charge of accommodation. He'd been looking for White and me because he had a cabin booked for us. So there we were, luxuriating between clean sheets, and outside our door, lying in the corridor, were some RAF officers. Private soldiers can get quite a lot of innocent pleasure from this sort of thing. While we were at sea, we were told that France was going to surrender and that Churchill had offered France some sort of political union. This thrilled me, because I do love France. Back in England, I think our Central Purchase Control Board must have been disbanded, because I had nowhere in particular to go. So I applied for a commission in the gunners. My father had been in the gunners in World War I, and anyhow, I didn't fancy the idea of marching, and gunners rode in trucks. So they took me on, and I went to an OCTU in Catterick. OCTU, O-C-T-U, stands for Officer Cadet Training Unit, and it was, if you survived, a 6-month course. Two things I remember of Catterick. For the first time, I went into a Catholic church. It was large and clean and airy, but didn't impress me one way or the other. And also, for the first time, I had to lecture to a room full of people. We had to speak for just 2 minutes, and I was terrified. I learnt off by heart what I'd written, and then, when my turn came, I stood up and headed for the podium. I remember nothing then of what followed till I got back to my place. Another thing I remember at Catterick was the eve of the day when they were going to decide whether to commission us or not, and I prayed very earnestly that I'd get through. I remember thinking that there could be all sorts of good I could do if commissioned, which otherwise would be beyond me. I should explain that immediately before the outbreak of war, I realized I had a vocation to the ministry, and was already preparing to enter an Anglican theological college. This explains the vocational view of things I took then. They decided to commission me, and I felt very elated and proud of my 1-pip. I even tried to grow a moustache, but this was beyond me. You could see that something was trying to happen, but after a month or so I gave up and shaved it off. When we left Catterick, we went on a few days' leave and then joined our new regiments. Mine was the Bedfordshire Yeomanry, 148 Field Regiment RA, and I stayed with them till the end of the war. The regiment was stationed in East Anglia, somewhere near Yarmouth. It was winter and very cold. We reckoned there was simply nothing between us and the Urals. However, I'd been there only a few days when we all moved up to Hoyk, just over the Scottish border. I remember one incident during the train journey up north. We were sitting in our carriage, some of us playing cards, some just chatting. We heard an air raid warning, but we all carried on with what we were doing, all except one man who suddenly cried out, "I don't know about you chaps, but I'm going to die fighting." And he leant out of the window, pointed his rifle at the sky, and fired. It takes all sorts to make the world. I always laugh. Every time I think of that, I laugh. While we were in Hawick, I got in touch with an elderly couple who were related by marriage to a man I'd been at school with. They were Delia and Walter Wilson, and they were very kind to me. One evening after dinner, I was looking at his books, a habit which is possibly bad manners, but one which I never even tried to correct. I pulled out a book by F.J. Sheed, Map of Life, and asked Mr. Wilson if it was any good. He took it and wrote my name in it and gave it to me. Then he took out another book, Catholic Belief, by Father Bruno, and wrote my name in that book too. Needless to say, I read them both avidly. That was the thin end of the wedge. The Catholic chaplain was a Father Aidan Jackson, OFM, Franciscan, and he would sometimes come with me to the Wilsons, and we'd talk a good deal about religion. Delia was Irish and a cradle Catholic, Walter an enthusiastic convert. I'm sure they both prayed for me. They also gave me a book called One Lord, One Faith by Vernon Johnson, and this convinced me that the Catholic Church must indeed be the true church. However, I was equally convinced that God wanted me to stay Anglican. It seemed obvious to me that if God had wanted me to be a Catholic, I'd have been born a Catholic, and anyhow, if I became a Catholic, who was going to look after all the Anglicans? When I said all this to Father Jackson, he just smiled and said nothing. Delia called me a vacillating Christian. I should mention something that happened around this time. I'd come to know a girl at one of the dances the town laid on for us, and had fallen into the habit of spending most evenings with her, generally at her parents' house. After a few weeks, she suggested marriage. I said, no, when the war's over, I'll be going on to the ministry, so I'll not be getting married. I mentioned this disedifying episode to make 2 points. First, that some young men, apparently quite decent, can sometimes be utterly self-centered and unaware of or even unconcerned about other people's feelings. In my work as a priest, I've so often had to tell girls this. God has made them with wonderful qualities, but in some ways they can be terribly blind and pathetically vulnerable. And the second point is this, that even to an Anglican in those days, celibacy seemed part and parcel of a full-time Christian ministry. After a short time at Hawick, we moved on to Rochdale in Lancashire, where we started our most serious training. Both the battery commander, Ronnie Archdale, and my troop commander, Peter Fane, were regulars. The rest of the officers in our battery were amateurs like me, volunteers for the duration. Ronnie and Peter were both about my age, perhaps a bit older. In Rochdale, we got to know a couple, Alec and Barbie, who had a tennis court, and we used to go around there every week. There were 5 of us generally who went, Ronnie and Peter, 2 other captains in our battery, Freddie Bradshaw and Andrew Barr, and myself. These weekly visits were our great relaxation. Forgetting the war for one afternoon, we'd bask in the warmth of light-hearted normality. I remember once Barbie said to Ronnie, who I suppose had come out with something especially outrageous, "Ronnie, you ought to be shot." And he came back with, "But Barbie, I'm terribly shocked." The senior lieutenant in the battery was Cordell Newbury. He was thin and austere, and I can't remember him laughing much, though he did save my life later on. The men were all billeted in an old warehouse, which they'd whitewashed from top to bottom. I remember him remarking that with another coat of whitewash, they'd all be going down with snow blindness. Peter Fane, being my troop commander, had the job of training me, and he was very strict. He said he knew he was giving me hell, but he had somehow to get 3 years training into me in 2 months. One night, I remember, I had to take the troop out for night exercises. I don't know how it happened, but we had a pile-up of guns and trucks at the bottom of a steep hill somewhere near Skipton in Yorkshire. So at about 2 o'clock in the morning, I had to come and break the news to Peter. He was lying there in his sleeping bag out in the open, and the moonlight fell on his face. He looked utterly peaceful, quite angelic, and I paused for a moment to look at him before waking him and shattering the peace of the night with my news. It must have been around this time in Lancashire that I once wandered into a Catholic church. It was a large church, quite empty, except for a choir practice going on somewhere up in a choir loft. I wandered down to the front, knelt down, and was suddenly overcome by a fit of weeping. It just went on and on. Eventually it finished, and I got up and went out. When this happens, I always take it as a sort of green light from God, a come-on signal. Finally, we moved down to Monmouth. I was billeted with the other subaltern in a small house owned by an old lady. My roommate smoked cigarettes incessantly. In the morning he'd wake up coughing, and would just cough and cough and cough while he groped for the cigarettes next to his bed. He'd put one in his mouth, light up, and inhale deeply. That set him up for the day. He was very good company. Someone told me he'd played cricket for his county, and he was certainly a great bridge player, smiling and relaxed, a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, never hesitating or seeming to think, and remembering every card. While we were in Monmouth, we went into the Welsh mountains for a week or two for firing practice. We were billeted in an old farmhouse with stone walls a yard thick. The countryside seemed all too beautiful for what we were doing, but I suppose we had somehow to disregard our better feelings. Otherwise we couldn't have carried on. It was while we were still in Monmouth that I decided to become a Catholic. I'd been on the ordinary Sunday morning church parade, but the sermon had left me unhappy. There was nothing wrong with it, but it just hadn't been about our Lord, and that morning it seemed to me that all I really wanted was Jesus. So after lunch I went round to the house next door to the little Catholic church and told the priest that I wanted to be a Catholic. The parish priest was a little old man with snuff stains all down the front of his cassock. And so far as I remember, the only instruction he gave me before we left on embarkation leave was on the shortcomings of our 16th century Queen Elizabeth. I went to Mass there, and everything seemed very strange. It had a strange smell, and even stranger singing, but what was strangest of all was the second collection. I'd never ever before heard of two collections in one service. From Monmouth, we were all sent home for a few days' embarkation leave. Then we reported back to Liverpool and embarked on our ships. We were the 18th Division under General Percival, mainly an East Anglian division. Besides ourselves, there were 3 regiments, the Beds and Herts, the Norfolks, and the Suffolks. I think there must have been others, but that's all I remember. Perhaps when I eventually finish this narrative, I should put what you sometimes see at the bottom of invoices, E and OE, errors and omissions accepted. So we all embarked and sailed out into an Atlantic Ocean, which as far as we knew was pretty well thronged with German submarines. I can't remember seeing any of our own navy escorting us, but then, after a day or so out at sea, we came up on deck to find ourselves surrounded by warships, the American Navy. This gave us quite a holiday feeling. We were sailing around the world on a cruise, escorted by the American Navy. I believe Roosevelt and Churchill had some sort of lease-lend arrangement by which the Americans gave us all the help we needed without their actually having to declare war on Germany. We made our way across the Atlantic and came to Halifax. We arrived in the evening after dark and feasted our eyes on the city lights. After blacked-out Britain, the lights gave our eyes something they seemed to need. Early next morning, we were to leave our ship and re-embark on an American ship. This involved the officers getting no breakfast. When I joined the regiment, I was told that the order of feeding was first the horses, if there were any, then the men, and finally the officers. And since second lieutenants were generally acknowledged to be the lowest things in God's creation, It meant that in the eating order, we were the last of the very last. Well, there was a second lieutenant in another unit whose name I forget. He always looked slightly slovenly. Once, when he'd spilled some beer down the front of his tunic, someone commented, "Anyhow, it'll help wash the egg off." Now, this young man was markedly keen on his food, and on this particular morning, of course, he'd had to miss his breakfast. On the way from our ship to the Manhattan Wakefield on which we were to embark, we had to pass through several warehouses. In one of these, there was a great pile of sacks containing some sort of bean. One of the sacks at the base of the pile had split and spilt beans out over the floor. This was our lad's big opportunity. He paused for a moment to scoop up a few handfuls and stuff them into his pockets, and for the rest of the morning was thus able to keep his stomach occupied. Unfortunately, the beans turned out to be strongly laxative, and the poor man was on the run for days. Perhaps I should apologize for these trivialities, but I'm writing 50 years on, and while pleasant or amusing incidents are still fresh in my memory, there must be less pleasant ones which I've happily forgotten. As I see it, that's how it should be. A healthy organism rejects what is harmful and accepts what makes for health. That's how our bodies work, and I think that's how it ought to be in our minds too. In this connection, let me tell you something that happened just after the war. I'd had to go to a hospital for tropical diseases for a checkup, and while there got talking with another ex-POW. He had something very wrong with his liver or kidneys. Anyhow, he was quite ill, and he told me how much he hated the Japanese. He said he'd met a couple of Japanese girls on the bus, and he'd insulted them, and this had made him feel really good. And I wondered to myself, which came first, his hatred of the Japanese or his sick innards? And I decided that it was his hatred that had poisoned his body. And if I may go on with my musing, if it's true, which it is, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, then, since God is love, it must be that hatred in the mind will lead to sickness in the body, and a cheerful, forgiving mind should make for health. That's how P.G. Woodhouse lived to the age of 92. So there we were, on board the troop ship, heading south. One day, far out at sea and out of sight of land, we saw that the sea had turned brown. Apparently, this was all part of Brazil, washed out to sea by the mighty Amazon. And when you think that this has been going on day and night for thousands of years, it makes you wonder how there can be any of Brazil left. And yet, of course, there is a great deal of it. But down on the floor of the Atlantic, there must be millions of tons of marvelous Brazilian mud. Doubtless there are creatures down there that thrive in it. The food on board was excellent, and they gave us vast helpings. I remember one man complained that his steak was too big and asked the steward if he could have a smaller one. The man picked it up between his finger and thumb, flipped it through the open porthole, and went to the galley for a smaller one. As we sailed further south, we had an enormous albatross accompany us for a time. It must have had a wingspan of about 12 feet. After that, we always referred to our chicken helpings as albatross. Many of the men played housey-housey pretty well non-stop. After the war, the game was known as bingo. But one group was playing Monopoly, and one of the players got so worked up over the game that he took off his watch, gave it to the banker, and said, give me £10,000. So the banker gave him £10,000 of the game's token currency, and the man was able to buy up Regent Street, or whatever it was he wanted. When the game was over, he said to the banker, "Can I have my watch back, please?" The banker said, "No, you sold it to me." "Don't be stupid. It was only a game." The banker insisted, so they brought in an officer to adjudicate. He decided in favor of the banker. Certainly it was a game, but you were serious. You sold him your watch. It was a stupid thing to do, but you did it. You must accept the consequences of being so stupid. I've often used that story. people barter their immortal souls for a mere nothing. It's the underlying pathos of so much of what you read in the papers. It's what makes a priest's job so very worthwhile. The ship went far south and the air got quite chilly. I can't remember if we met any icebergs, but on the other hand we didn't meet any German submarines, and that was the object of the exercise. So we approached Cape Town as though we were coming up from a visit to the South Pole. And it was at about this part of our journey that Pearl Harbor happened, and America came into the war. Overnight, the American crew on our ship became serious, and something of the party atmosphere on board vanished. We had 4 days shore leave in Cape Town, reporting back to the ship each evening. A part of the city, District 6, was out of bounds, otherwise we should go where we liked. We were, I think, the 17th convoy to have called there, yet people were so kind to us we might well have been the first. I remember once another fellow and I were standing on the curb discussing what we might do when a car drew up, and a man asked us if there was anywhere we wanted to go. We had no idea, of course, so he offered to take us to his club. He was Jewish, I remember, and he took us to his country club and entertained us till it was time to take us back to our ship. The strawberries and cream we had there are somehow burnt into my memory. On another occasion, we went to a dance at the Mount Nelson Hotel. This hotel, I was told, is built of Aberdeen granite, brought out to Cape Town as ballast on ships that exported South African produce to Scotland. While we were at the dance, General Smuts arrived. The music stopped, and we all gathered around to hear what he had to say. Maybe he always spoke in a rather slurred way, but my guess was he'd already been celebrating somewhere else. He certainly was in very good spirits. He said, "You know, we ought to put up a statue to the Japanese here in Cape Town. They've at last brought those Americans into the war." This was less than a week after Pearl Harbor, but the poor man wasn't to know that all the naval officers in the room were Americans. There was a certain amount of muttering among them. We met a girl at that dance. When one's in uniform, one's always meeting girls, and she was keen on sailing, so she took 2 of us out in a little drop-keel dinghy on a lake, which I think she called a flay. This was very enjoyable. In fact, South Africa is altogether a most beautiful country. However, the brandy I had, though I suppose it must have been one of their cheaper brands, seemed pure firewater, and as for their Cape to Cairo cigarettes, they're called just C to C on the packet. We call them Camel to Consumer. Finally, we re-embarked for the last leg of our journey onto Bombay. There was a Catholic chaplain on our ship, Father Michael A. Halley, and as soon as we left Halifax, I'd introduced myself to him. So in all these weeks, I'd been going to him for instructions. By now, we got to the end of the catechism, and he said I was ready to be received. So far as I remember, the only 2 things I was sure about were that Christ was God, which I'd always known, and that the Catholic Church was the true church. There were many things I didn't understand, and some I didn't like, but I kept my mouth shut, because I felt sure I had the faith, and I just wanted to be a Catholic as soon as possible. So on the Saturday evening of the weekend before Christmas, he received me into the church and heard my confession, and at Mass next day I made my first Holy Communion. I'd been dreading that first confession, but Father Halley made it very easy for me, and as I came away I thought that if I got nothing more out of the church than this one sacrament, it would have been well worth all the trouble. My heart was really very full, and I went up to the boat deck under the night sky, where I could be alone and give vent to many tears of gratitude. For a day or so in the Indian Ocean, we had an enormous shark swimming alongside. Someone told me of the superstition that sharks always know when someone's going to die, so they can get the body. And sure enough, someone on board did die, followed, I suppose, by burial at sea. At long last, we arrived at Bombay and went by train to Pune. Our mess, I remember, was in Prince of Wales Drive. This was in the last days of December 1941. In England, our motorbikes had been fitted with dust excluders for use in the desert, and it was assumed that we were to be trained for desert warfare. However, it was to be otherwise. We'd not even unloaded our guns when, early in the new year, we were told to re-embark. So we returned to Bombay and got back on our ships. We understood we'd be sailing under sealed orders. As the ship steamed out of Bombay harbour, we were all on deck, wondering whether it was to be North Africa or Singapore. All the ships sailed due west for about half an hour. Then, in one movement, the whole fleet turned south. It was to be Singapore. The news wasn't too good about Singapore. Indeed, as the days went by, it got worse. The Japanese sank one of our battleships in those waters. I'm not sure they didn't sink two. They seemed to be carrying all before them. We docked at Singapore in the last days of January 1942. As we disembarked, we saw RAF personnel embarking on the next ship. That was all we saw of the RAF. It wasn't until some years after the war that I learned why. One of our officers, Indian Army, was seconded to the RAF, who had a Japanese girlfriend, had been betraying to the Japanese the whereabouts of our planes. So even though we frequently moved them, the Japs kept up their accurate bombing and eventually put virtually all our planes out of action. One day, during an air raid, when he wasn't in the dugout with the others, someone went to his room and found a radio transmitter still warm. He was arrested and sent down to Singapore. A day or so before we surrendered, he said to the other prisoners, "Well, I'll soon be free, and you'll be either dead or prisoners." And the officer in charge took out his service revolver and shot him dead. So the result of this one man's treachery was that during the fighting we had no air cover and the Japanese had a walkover. My memories of the fighting are a bit hazy, but I remember a few incidents. Quite early on, soon after we landed, it must have been known that we'd have to surrender, so they organized an escape party. Peter Fane was going to be on it, and he told me that I was to be in charge of the troop. To begin with, we were somewhere in the north of the island, and I remember we had to set up our guns in a coconut grove. To get firing clearance for the guns, we had to cut down some trees. Cutting down coconut trees wasn't one of the things we've been practicing in England. I remember one tree landed right through the roof of a hut. A man came out and said, "Hey, that's my house." all I could think of was to say, well, there's a war on, poor man. But I think the sort of roof they have there is fairly easily repaired. They make it, or at least they used to make it then, of layers of dried palm leaf. This keeps the house cool and also keeps out most of the rain. Another time, I had to keep a watch out at night on the northern shoreline. As I watched the two horns of the moon slowly come up over the horizon, I imagined it might be Satan himself coming up to have a look at the world and enjoy the sight of us all fighting each other. With nothing happening, I began to examine a map with my torch and noticed that the creek next to where I was lying was called Crocodile Creek. I thought about this. If it was called Crocodile Creek, there could well be crocodiles there. And it was just round the corner from where I was lying, a yard or two from the water's edge. After that, I found myself very attentive to the sounds of the water as it lapped on the beach. Every little sound suggested a crocodile sniffing his way up to his next meal. Another time, I remember I was in a trench, again on the north shore, and Japanese shells were coming over. I counted 94 landing the far side of me, and 405 on the near side. At the time, it never occurred to me that one might land in my trench. Before the fighting began, I remember I'd been very afraid lest I should be afraid. But when once it had started, it never even entered my head that I might be a casualty myself. Maybe it's a matter of temperament, or maybe I assumed my guardian angel would always be on top of the job. Maybe a bit of both. Certainly, later on in the fighting, when a Japanese shell landed between my feet as I walked across the field by our guns and didn't go off. I somehow took it for granted. Obviously, defusing a shell would be child's play to an angel. But all the same, there was something exhilarating about it all while the fighting was going on, and I must admit I enjoyed it. It was while we were still in the north of the island that, feeling tired one day, I decided to have a siesta. Since I was in charge of the troop, I reckoned it important that I should keep fresh. So I went into my tent and was soon fast asleep. Just then, Ronnie Archdale came round to see how we were doing. When he found me asleep in my tent, he gave me the biggest rocket I've ever had in my life. I was very fond of him, and this upset me a lot, and I remember I wept after he'd gone. Still, no doubt, it did do me some good. A large field, when Caldwell Newbury strolled along and suggested I move them to another part. He gave no reason why, but I moved them, and sure enough, the Japanese later heavily shelled the position we'd first taken up. At the OCTU back in England, we'd been given lectures on German fighting methods. I thought these lectures rather pointless. I didn't know how I was meant to fight myself, and they seemed to me a bit much to have to learn how the Germans did it. But as it turned out, our ignorance of the ways the Japanese did things enabled them to make fools of us. In those days, we didn't know one Oriental from another, so the Jap soldiers would change into civvies, tuck a weapon under their shirt, and cycle through our lines. Our men would probably give them a friendly wave as they passed. Then, once behind our lines, they'd start sniping at us. This made us a bit jittery. I remember that we'd been exchanging rifle fire with some people on the far side of the field, thinking they were Japs, when suddenly, in a lull in the shooting, we heard a cry from the people we'd been firing at, "For Christ's sake, stop shooting." Every troop had its tannoy system, so that the firing orders could be heard clearly by each gun. I brought a little wind-up gramophone with me from home, so when nothing else was happening, I broadcast records to the gun teams. It was good fun being an amateur disc jockey, and I think they appreciated the music. And then, when orders to fire came down from the battery command post, I'd lift the needle off the record and call, "Take post." There was an abandoned bungalow just behind our guns, and I used this as a troop command post. Many of the people who lived in Singapore had guessed what would happen and had managed to get out in time. I think the general assumption among our own troops was that although the future of Singapore looked pretty bleak, we were going to fight it out to the last round of the last man. Morale was very good. So when, on Saturday, February the 14th, we were told that we were going to surrender at 4 o'clock the following afternoon, we were shattered. The main feeling, I think, was one of terrible humiliation. That we'd ever have to surrender, and to the Japs of all people. I remember seeing one of our sergeants sitting at his gun, weeping, and I think I'm right in saying that he was weeping for England. I've never felt so patriotic in my life. I smoked in those days, and I remember throwing all my smoking gear into a hedge and saying, "Never again till I'm free." Actually, I started again a week or so later, and only gave it up when it got down to smoking tea leaves. We were all going around like men in a dream, not speaking for shame and sorrow. At nightfall, I went into my bungalow command post. The owner had left his gramophone there with a record in it. It was too dark to see what it was, so I wound up the machine and put the needle on and slumped back into an armchair, prepared to be given over to melancholy. The music started. It was a mandolin dance band playing Tristesse, which starts off, I think, "How Still Is the Night." The music had been taken from something of Chopin's. Sitting there, dry-eyed, I let the music weep for me. As the melody went out into the still tropical night, I felt that all nature and the very stars must be sharing our grief. I kept that record and went on playing it as long as I could. Once, after the war, when I told someone this, he said, "But that was looting." Well, I'm not sure about that. But as I said earlier, in wartime things seem a bit different. Later, in the prison camp, I met a man who'd driven down from Kuala Lumpur to Singapore, keeping ahead of the Japs, and on the way down had gone into an abandoned music store. There was a pile of gramophone records on the counter, so he picked them up and put them in the back of his truck. After the surrender, he looked to see what he'd got, but was disappointed to find they were all copies of King George VI's Christmas speech. I remember only one fatal casualty in our troop during the fighting, and he'd been my batman, a very quiet, good man, older than me. It was the last few days before the surrender. I was walking across our field by our guns in the early morning when it was still dark, and saw a body lying on the ground. It was this dear man. His side had been blown out by a shell, and he must have died at once. After the war, I'd been at home only a day or two when his widow called, asking for news of her husband. This was the saddest thing that happened to me in all the years of the war. I suppose I should have reported his death at once, so that the Red Cross could perhaps have been told, and the news got back to his wife. The thing I certainly did forget was to blow up our guns. We'd been told all about this in the OCTU course. The way you do it is to load the gun, stick another shell in the muzzle, tie a long string to the firing handle, get everyone out of the way, and then pull the trigger. A spectacular thing to do, and quite apart from our giving the Japs 4 perfectly good guns, I'm sorry I deprived everyone of the experience. Next day, the Japanese made us all march off to the northeast corner of the island, a part known as Changi, which was to be our prison area. As we went along the roads, we saw little Japanese flags on every house and in every garden, but we realized that this was only an excusable means of self-protection and indicated no real change of heart. The part of the island that we'd been given was the most healthy and had been our military station. So the roads and houses and drainage. There were stores of food there too, so what with surrounding the area with triple rolls of barbed wire, digging latrines, repairing the drainage, which had been put out of order by the shelling, and finding accommodation for everyone, we seemed to be looking after ourselves for a week or so before the Japanese sent out much of a guard to administer the camp. Besides our own 18th Division, there were also an Australian division and some Indian troops. In fact, we guessed that this was perhaps why we'd come to Singapore at all. We thought that Churchill had perhaps been told that Singapore could not hold out, and since the only people defending the island, apart from the small British garrison, was this Australian division and a lot of Indian troops, he diverted our 18th Division into the trap for the sake of public relations. From the very first, the Japanese separated officers from men. I suppose this was the obvious thing to do. It would make it easier for them to control us if trouble broke out. So in our part of the camp, we had just officers, Australians, Gurkhas, and ourselves. Very early on, the Japanese had a triumphant motorcade. We, in our thousands, lined the road that led up from Singapore, and a stream of large cars, which of course had been ours, slowly drove through, so that the Japanese general and his senior officers could see the extent of their victory. It was quite the most galling thing I remember. There were not many who attempted escape, and of those who did, few reached safety. The Japanese held the seas for 1,000 miles and more around Singapore, and in all the neighbouring islands, rewards were offered to the natives for the capture of white troops. The only people we could always trust were the Chinese. During the first few months of our captivity, life was very peaceful. Small working parties went down to the city of Singapore in the south of the island to clean up the bomb damage, and there we had the consolation of experiencing the kindness of the Singaporeans. Of the 1 million or so people in Singapore, most were Chinese. They and the Eurasians, or people of mixed birth, were kindness itself. They treated us as though we were their own sons or brothers. I saw an old Chinese man walking unobtrusively through a crowd of our men, giving out money as he passed. I saw Chinese children sent by their parents with armfuls of fruit for us. I saw an old Chinese woman hawking tobacco by the roadside throw us packets of cheroots as we passed. And in this last case, the Japanese guard turned on her, knocked her down, and when he couldn't get us to accept her wares, threw them into the deep gutter. Our official position was now that of slaves, and we were given little tickets to pin on our clothing, which apparently put us at the disposal of any Japanese troops that met us. Anyhow, that was how it worked out in practice. If you weren't already doing a job under the eye of a Japanese soldier, any other soldier who wanted something done would just beckon to you and tell you in sign language, and perhaps with a word or two of English, and always with an accompaniment of angry threatening noises, what he wanted done. The manner of beckoning caused a little confusion at first. If they wanted you to approach, they would wave their hand at you like a woman waving goodbye. So in the early days, a man would hear a roar, and looking up, would see a Japanese soldier waving at him in this ambiguous way. Reckoning that he was where he ought not to be, he would begin to make off, only to hear another and fiercer roar. Heavens, the man was waving angrily. Our poor prisoner would quicken his pace, and on hearing a maddened roar of rage, would drop all pretense of dignity and fly in panic. But we soon learned. Their practice of face-slapping made up in some respects for their want of English. At first, this was a great shock to us, but as with so many other things, we got used to it in time. The first time I had my face slapped was when I was down in the city of Singapore. Officers didn't have to work, but one was always detailed to go with each working party. I'd detached myself from my working party to do some shopping, and was walking back along a lonely road to rejoin it, when a lorry full of Indian soldiers, with 2 or 3 Japanese in front, passed me. I wasn't anxious, because anyone, I thought, seeing a British officer out by himself in uniform, would assume that he was on some duty. But the lorry stopped, and a little Japanese corporal came back and said, "Pass, pass." I felt flummoxed, and gave him a piece of paper with some English writing on it. I thought that anyhow he probably couldn't read. Before I knew what had happened, he'd slapped me hard on the face. I stared at him in astonishment and anger. Not that I felt angry, I was too surprised, but he looked as though he were going to slap me again. As it was, he just directed me back to the camp and returned to his lorry. And I stood there, feeling ashamed of myself. That Indian soldiers should have witnessed such an indignity seemed to me to reflect dishonor on my country. I still had a lot to learn about what makes for honor and dishonor. We had a number of army chaplains taken prisoner too, and this made all the difference. Our Catholic chaplains began to offer Mass daily. I remember I used to attend Father Whelan's Mass every morning. He was a Holy Ghost father and had been a missionary. In those days, priests had to hold their forefinger and thumb together after the consecration, in case any fragments of the host should stick to them and drop on the floor. So, kneeling behind him, I thought that on each of his hands, the top of his forefinger was missing. I like to fantasize about things, and I soon decided that Father Whelan, in some heroic missionary exploit, had the tops of these 2 fingers bitten off by hippopotamus. Actually, Father Whelan was indeed heroic. The Japanese had told us that anyone leaving the camp would be shot. We'd heard that a man who tried to escape and been recaptured was going to be executed in Changi jail. This was a mile down the road. We didn't know who he was, but Father Whelan set off to see him, to hear his confession if need be, or anyhow to help him prepare for death. Father Whelan got there and back safely, but we all knew it was a really heroic thing to do. He asked me once to get some altar prayers for himself and the other priests, so next day when I was out with my working party, I asked my way to the cathedral. Rang at the presbytery and was led upstairs, where I found the bishop playing billiards all by himself. I fancy he was French. I told him what the priest wanted, and he asked how many altar breads they needed. I had no idea, but I said 200. He counted them out one by one, while I was sweating with anxiety, lest my absence from the working party should be noticed. However, he also gave me a copy of St. Teresa's Story of a Soul in French. This, like everything else, was providential and helped me a lot. And when I read it, I swapped it for a copy of The Imitation of Christ. To begin with, I suppose our priests had enough altar wine, but I was told that later on they made their own by soaking raisins in water, crushing them when swollen, and then fermenting the result. I was told they offered Mass using 3 drops of wine and 1 of water. It wasn't long before food shortage began to be a main problem, as it was to be for the next 3.5 years. However, we had strength enough still for other interests beside the main one of keeping alive. Many had been teachers or had specialist qualifications in pre-war days, in real life, as we would say, and they began running courses in this and that. The chaplains, too, started instruction classes. So, of course, we built chapels. The Japanese, I must say at once, never put obstacles in our way in this matter, though, of course, they didn't help us with materials. But they never objected to our practicing our religion. There had been a large Catholic church in Singapore which had been completely demolished by several direct hits, and the ruins provided us with timber, tiles, and statues for several little chapels. We had a choir, too, and sang the Missa de Angelis, and even one of Terry's Masses in 3 parts. But before this came off, they asked me to leave. Apparently, the chaplain said to someone, "Do please get that man to start Mass and stop him singing. It'll be one of the joys of heaven that we all be able to sing in tune, and we'll be able to sing as much as we like without having the people in front looking round." I'd like to say something about my attitude to the Japanese. In fact, it's partly because of this that I wanted to write all this in the first place. First, as I think I've said, I never hated them. The reason I never tried to learn their language or have anything to do with them was because I felt it was not right to do so. I obeyed them because I had to, but never wished to fraternize with them in any way. We were enemies as long as the war lasted, and that was how I wanted to behave. Since the war, and this is something I don't understand, I find I have a special affection for them. Maybe there's a psychological reason for this. St. Patrick wanted to go back to the island where he'd been a slave to evangelize the Irish. St. Isaac Jogues, after terrible sufferings, went back to his beloved Indians and to martyrdom. And Father Lionel Marsden, one of the great heroes of the prison camps, as I'll say later, volunteered for the Japanese mission after the war. After my ordination, for many years, I was a chaplain to overseas students, and I found that my heart always warmed, especially to any Japanese I came across, and I always tried to help them. The fact that they made us their slaves never struck me as being unreasonable. Since time began, prisoners of war who could not be ransomed have been enslaved. How else was Hadrian's Wall built? I read somewhere that the whole economy of the Roman Empire depended on the slave markets. Having said that, I should add that we took great pleasure in stealing off the Japanese whenever we could get away with it. They'd first stolen it all off us, so we, of course, took back all we could. I heard of an Australian who had the job of transporting cans of petrol from a warehouse to the docks for sailing to Japan. He made his job easier by selling every other lorry load to the Chinese, and when the warehouse was empty, he sold the lorry. Another story I heard was of a Japanese officer who came to a camp to lecture the troops about stealing. He was surprised that the British were such thieves. I don't think they distinguished much between the Australians and ourselves. So he lectured them at some length, and then got back into his car and drove off. But the poor man didn't get very far. While he'd been speaking, someone had siphoned the petrol out of his tank. Life in Changi got into a fairly ordered routine. Working parties went out every morning to continue with their work of clearing up bomb damage. In the evenings, people would gather together to chat or sing or listen to various talks that were being arranged. We were making the best of our reduced circumstances, and really making quite a good thing of it. But early in 1943, the Japanese interrupted this routine. They began drafting men away in parties, several thousand at a time, for an unknown destination. This introduced an undercurrent of fear into the camp. The air was vibrant, you could say, with the sound of people pulling strings to get off these moves. For myself, as I was in the camp hospital with dysentery, I stayed behind in Singapore with the majority. Before long, word came back to us that these parties had gone to Siam to begin work on a railway. The Japanese, it seemed, had decided to add India to their conquests. For the invasion, they needed a railway to link the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. It would run from Bangkok in Siam to Moulmein in Burma, through the jungles and forests and mountains of the interior. For this purpose, they press-ganged all available labor in that part of Asia: Chinese, Malayans, Indians, plantation hands, and of course all their prisoners of war. So one after another, these working parties disappeared from the camp, taking all the fit men with them. Those of us left behind thought we were going to stay there till the end of the war. But one day, the peace of our prison life was broken by talk of another draft upcountry. The Japanese reassured us by saying it was not a working party they needed. Food was short on the island, so they were going to establish a camp further north where it was more plentiful. I was included in an officers' party of 300 destined for administrative work in the camp. The position was this. The engineer in charge of building the railway had told the emperor that he would commit harakiri if it weren't finished by September 1943, and he was now well behind schedule. There were 20 cuttings still to be excavated. Perhaps I should have mentioned earlier that the Japanese rather despised us officers because we hadn't all committed harakiri when Singapore fell. By their standards, to let ourselves be taken prisoner was extremely dishonorable. In case you don't know, harakiri, that is, in Japanese, hara meaning belly, kiri meaning cut. Harakiri is a particularly revolting sort of suicide involving disembowelment. I expect it comes to their due course. So this Japanese engineer had a strong personal interest in getting his railway finished on time. He reckoned that if he could have another 10,000 men, he could do it. I suppose it was because they knew there were some people so good at getting off things that they could get off everything short of the general judgment, that they said this last group was destined simply for a rest camp in the hills of Malaya. There was thus quite a cheerful atmosphere in the camp as we got ready for the move. People took musical instruments with them, and indeed all their remaining possessions. The rail journey tested our good spirits. There were 27 of us in each truck, packed in with all our luggage. Trucks had been used, I think, for carrying rubber and tin, and were made all of iron, measuring about 15 feet by 5 feet. Inside these, roasted by day and chilled by night, hunched up or sprawling across each other, we jolted and rattled our way up north, cheered by the thought of the rest camp that awaited us. Although we stopped only once a day for food, that was cold rice, black tea, and a small piece of dried fish, the train would occasionally stop for a few minutes to let us stretch our legs. Then we'd crawl back into our cages, and as the engine started up again 50 yards ahead of us, we'd hear a crescendo of crashes approaching us as each truck in turn was jerked into motion. At the climax of the crescendo, we too were jerked forward and our journey continued. When we reached the end of the line, we were placed in a transit camp. This had been used by all the troops passing through, and since none of them had had the opportunity of exercising any hygiene control, was unbelievably filthy. While we were here, we heard that the troops ahead of us had been started on a 250-mile march through the jungle, and we began to realize a little of what we were in for. After 2 days in this transit camp, we entrained again and traveled for a last few miles along the new railway line that had just been completed. When we finally reached the end of the line, we began, in our turn, night marches through the jungle. So we began our long march. I had to decide how much kit I'd be able to carry, balancing my dislike of a heavy load against the wretchedness of having to part with treasured possessions. I forget how many nights we marched, or how far. It's as jumbled in my memory as a dream, or perhaps I should say, a nightmare. One night, I remember, we were marching, or straggling might be a better word, down a road with a forest on either side, and there, over to our right, I could hear a drum beating. I pictured to myself someone sitting under a palm tree, with his family all round him, his wives and his children, with him tapping away at his drum. He was poor, perhaps, and perhaps illiterate, but he was free, and I was a slave. Unless you have yourself been deprived of your freedom, it's hard to realize how precious it is. People who prize material advantage above personal freedom deserve to lose both. The Israelites, who just escaped from slavery and yet wanted to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt, never reached the land of freedom, flowing with milk and honey. They died in the desert. Apparently, Dame Cho Ping used to say that the most important right of every Chinese citizen was to have a decent meal every day. When I heard that on the radio, I thought, that's just where he was wrong. He was never a slave himself. Poor, maybe, and a victim of injustice, but never a slave. Slavery is worse than hunger or illiteracy or ill health. Slavery strips you of everything and cuts you off from free men. In the early days, when I was in Singapore on those working parties, I'd be walking through a crowd of people and felt as though there were an invisible wall of plate glass between them and me. They were all free, and I was a slave. In fact, without the faith which makes your heart safe and free from human intrusion, I doubt if I could have survived those years. I don't think I ever really blamed the Japanese for having enslaved us and treating us the way they did. The innate dignity of each individual is a Christian concept. And since I suppose the Japanese were pagans, I couldn't blame them. I told myself, you can't blame pagans for behaving like pagans. Mind you, that's not quite the way I talk today, but in this narrative I'm trying to recapture the events and mentality of those war years. In those days, if people weren't Christians or Jews or Muslims, we might call them pagans, and to me anyhow, Thailand was still known as Siam. During that long march, I remember that on another occasion, 3 of us decided we'd marched far enough for one night. We'd have a nap and catch up later. At the side of the track, there was some raised ground, and there we lay down. Because of the mosquitoes, the other 2 covered themselves with their ground sheets, but I covered myself with a Union Jack. I'd picked it up somewhere, and it happened to lie on top inside my pack. Sooner or later, I suppose, we'd win the war. I wanted to be able to nail it up and sing Rule Britannia or God Save the King. So I covered myself with my Union Jack. Next morning at first light, a small party of Japanese soldiers came trotting past, and some of them came out to investigate. Seeing these shrouded bodies, one of them covered with a flag, they cried out, "Cholera, cholera," and made off as quickly as they could. Sometimes I think we must have marched by day, because I distinctly remember once seeing the man in front of me stop, lower his bundle to the ground, put it behind a tree, and go on carrying nothing. In the hope of saving his physical life, he parted with all he had. If people would only make a fraction of such a sacrifice to save their spiritual lives and their immortal souls. Ordinarily, we marched at night because of the heat during the day, and one morning, as dawn was breaking, I caught up with the head of the column and found that we'd arrived. It was just another bit of jungle, but this was to be our home, so we cleared the undergrowth, which was mostly bamboo, and pitched our tents. Our group of 300 officers was made up of Gurkhas, Australians, and ourselves. And it was up here in the jungle that the Aussies really showed what they could do. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think they had their tents up and their dinner cooking while we were still debating where to pitch our tents. And later on, as I'll show, they were most enterprising in the way they introduced meat into our diet. We'd expected to sleep on the ground, but the Japanese would not allow this and showed us how to make raised sleeping platforms from bamboo. So we got the tents up, lit cookhouse fires, and dug latrines, glad that we'd at last stopped moving. Our job in this camp was to prepare timber for the railway. We went out in parts of 20 to where trees had been felled, and then, with bamboo poles across our shoulders and wires going from them under the trunks, we would jog our way down forest paths to where they were to be dumped. I think the wood was mostly teak. It was certainly appallingly heavy, and the taller amongst us suffered greatly, having to bear so great a weight in a stooping position. Once I passed another of our parties at work. One of their number had dropped out, and the Japanese in charge had found a Chinaman to take his place. As he jogged along beneath his load, with his flattish conical hat, his flapping cotton trousers, and his composed air, he stamped his companions, who were wearing tattered remnants of officers' uniforms and didn't look really comfortable, as amateurs at the game. As I've said, we weren't the only people working on the railway. There were enormous numbers of Tamils and Chinese, in fact anyone the Japanese had been able to lay hands on. Once I met someone from what I think we used to call French Indochina, and we conversed in pidgin French. I think we were both probably equally pidgin. For a few weeks while I was in this camp, I went out with a small party whose work it was to square up timber. We had a very pleasant little Japanese with us who knew something about the work and taught us how to use an adze. An adze is like an axe, but with the blade at right angles to the shaft. He showed us how to stand astride the tree and swing the adze down to take a slice off the trunk. On each trunk, he'd mark the lines we had to work down to, and when we got it more or less right, we turned the trunk over and do the next side. As long as you hit the tree and not your own leg, it was very enjoyable. Sometimes, too, we worked with an elephant. There was a boy sitting on top of it who was in charge, and the elephant drew a little sledge to which a tree trunk was tied. And then one of us would be detailed to walk behind the elephant to shout to the boy if the tree trunk came off. It was wonderful walking through the forest on a fine morning, right away from everyone, just you and the elephant and the boy. Once I spent most of the morning on top of the elephant talking with a boy who wanted to buy my watch. But he didn't have enough money, and anyhow, it wasn't very comfortable because I was wearing only a pair of cotton underpants, and the elephant's back is prickly. Another time, the elephant gave me a shower bath. It had been raining during the night, though now it was sunny, and when we passed a deep rut in the track full of water, the elephant put his trunk down as he passed and hooshed up a quantity of water. He then hoisted up his trunk and discharged it over his back, with a good share coming to me, walking immediately behind him. One day, the elephant didn't turn up, and we asked where he was. He was having a day off. We protested, jokingly, because we knew it was no use. We knew that their elephants were few and precious, while we were many and expendable. The purpose of this particular camp was to build a bridge across a valley. So far as I remember, it was done by wiring two lines of timbers together in crisscross fashion up to the required height, with horizontal timbers across the top to carry the rails. I thought it marvelously ingenious, especially as the man in charge seemed to be doing it all by eye. After the war, I came across that book, Bridge Over the River Kwai, and read a few pages, but I thought it gave such a false impression I stopped reading. It seemed to make out the Japanese to be stupid. Well, one thing they're not stupid. I used to compare them in my mind to the ancient Romans, the same discipline, the same engineering ability, the same courage and resourcefulness. And as for their ruthlessness, what empire ever came into being without it? When we'd been in this camp about 6 weeks, we were told that we were now needed to work further up the line. It's absurd how fond one gets of a piece of jungle, but certainly we were all sorry to leave. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know was the general attitude. During this next march, I remember we had to pass through one of our camps where they'd had cholera. We lay on the ground in the sun, waiting for dinner and looking around at the huts set in the clearing. Apart from our party, there was hardly a man to be seen. It was as silent as the grave. Only later did we learn why. It was a grave. Almost the whole camp had died of cholera. We had only a few nights' march to reach our new campsite. This was in a magnificent setting on a high bluff above a river and sheltered by tall trees. Once we'd cleared the bamboos and set up our tents, our spirits began to revive. Unfortunately, the Japanese gave us no respite, but within a few hours of our arrival, sent the first party out to work on the railway. We were to work in 2 shifts of 12 hours each, and to begin with, I was on the day shift. This was from 6 to 6. We got up at about 4 o'clock, and after a mugful of hot, wet rice, paraded. This always took an age. Because men were sick, we could never muster the number of workers required. Men who were soon to find relief in death were brought out of the hospital tent and sent out to work with the rest of us. The sun did not rise till about 7:30, so all this took place in the dark and often in the rain, for it was then the rainy season. At last we could leave for work. 1 or 2 men would carry empty milk tins in which were pieces of cotton waste burning in oil, and the rest of us would follow, pressing close behind each other, fearful in that trackless jungle of losing sight of the man with the light. After 3/4 of an hour of stumbling through the forest, we heard the roar of an air compressor engine, and soon we were at the cutting that was to be the scene of our labors for the next 2 months. It was an astonishing sight. About half the cutting had already been excavated, and there was a 12-foot road running into the heart of the hill, where it seemed blocked by an enormous fall of rock. Over the face of this, and working along the light railway that ran to the foot of it, were some 200 men. There was no moon, but their bodies shone in the light of numbers of naphthalene lamps. Here and there were Japanese soldiers, watching moodily or shouting angrily. There was a continual roar of pneumatic drills. The faces of the prisoners were expressionless with fatigue. Really, it looked just like hell. We took their places. This was the occasion of a wonderful act of heroism by, I think, an Australian. As the new shift came up to start work, he saw among them a pal of his, obviously a very sick man. "Hey, chum, you go back and lie down. I'll do your shift." And he took his place for another 12-hour shift. Heaven must have marveled at that charity. Later on, when the Japanese saw that too many of us were dying, they changed our shifts from being 2 12-hour shifts to 3 8-hour ones. The work was done by drilling holes in the rock, dropping in a jars of dynamite, lighting it, and then clearing away the debris after the explosion. The cry of "Dynamito" from the Japanese soldier never seemed to come in time for us to reach the shelter safely, but I don't think anyone was ever hurt. Once there was something of a panic as the rocks started falling among us as we ran. I was caught up in the panic, and it was a horrid feeling. Your instinct for self-preservation gets the start of your reason and seems to blind it. I remember running over someone who tripped up, and the difficulty, when I was myself again, of apologizing to him. We had a young Japanese officer there, always very well dressed in light blue uniform, whom we called Little Boy Blue. When the dynamite was lit and we were running for shelter, he disdained to move, but just stood there on high ground with his hand on his sword hilt. After the explosion, we would return to the cutting to remove the debris. We had a number of little wicker baskets, and a dozen or so of us would stand in a double line, passing them down one side loaded to be emptied onto a truck, and then back along the other side to be filled by a man with a shovel. It was surprising how much work we did in this primitive way. I no longer marvel at the pyramids. You could shift Table Mountain to Timbuktu if you had enough slaves and enough whips. We've been tipping the excavated rock over the side of the hill, and this had now become a pier running out into the valley, with a light railway running along the top of it. When the truck was full, the rocks under its wheels would be removed. There was a cry of warning, and with 2 men aboard, it would rush down to the end of the pier, where 2 men would be waiting to tip the rubble into the valley below. Then the 2 passengers would push the truck back to the rock face to the team with the wicker baskets. For 5 minutes every hour we had a rest. The Japanese would call out "smoko," and we'd all stop work, some to sleep, some to have a smoke, some to lean against the rock and talk. One night I was working at the end of the pier with an American merchant seaman called Kelly, who'd been landed at Singapore from a German submarine. Kelly wasn't his real name, but that was what we called him. As I've said, this pier was made up from the rocks we'd taken from the cutting, and it now ran 100 yards out into the valley, with a light railway laid on top of it. On either side of the line, the rocks fell away steeply, and Kelly and I seemed poised between heaven and earth. There was no moon, and the only light we had came from a rag burning in oil in a milk tin. Every few minutes a truck would rattle down the line out of the darkness, and we would stop it and then push the rocks over the side of the truck into the darkness below. On one occasion, Kelly was trying to shift a very heavy boulder all by himself. I was daydreaming, in as far as you can daydream in the middle of the night, and suddenly realized I was letting him do all the work. He was pulling it over towards himself, so I got under it my side and gave a mighty heave. It shot off the truck and disappeared into the abyss, and for one awful moment it looked as though Kelly were going to follow it. But he recovered his balance and then began to swear at me. He swore at me steadily for about a minute. I forget just what he said, but I remember feeling very frightened at the intense meaning he put into his words. Still, we laughed about it later. When we were on the day shift, we'd stop at noon for a half-hour's dinner break. Our dinner was a pint mug of rice and another full of tea, always, of course, without milk or sugar. Sometimes, too, we had a piece of dried fish as big as your finger, which was very appetizing and also, apparently, full of proteins. Some people seemed to know how to count proteins and calories, as they saw them all lined up in front of them. When the 30 minutes were up, there'd be a roar from the guard. We'd start work again. On these day shifts, we suffered greatly from thirst. You can forget hunger because the weakness it brings acts as an anodyne, but thirst keeps in the forefront of your thoughts. To begin with, perhaps, I would think of what I could do with a pint of beer. Then I would change the order to shandy. As my thirst grew, I decided the soft drinks were better and toyed with the idea of freshly made lemonade. Or perhaps I think of the tea that would be waiting for us back in the camp. But I always ended up by thinking of water. I used to think sometimes that there were probably many men in England who would envy me my thirst. When eventually we were back in the camp, we would drink 2 pints of tea straight off, and it seemed to go nowhere. What we needed, though we didn't realize it at the time, was salt. The medical staff kept all the salt that came into the camp, so the rest of us, with all the sweating we did, suffered greatly from a shortage of salt, and it was this that gave us our chronic thirst. When we got back to Singapore, we would go down to the sea and bring back buckets of seawater in which we would cook our vegetables. When you've been without salt for a long time, seawater is delicious. Mention of the medical staff reminds me of their resourcefulness. They had no medicines, but for all stomach complaints they gave us wood charcoal. Charcoal somehow absorbs poison. Tapioca leaves, for instance, are poisonous, but after boiling with wood charcoal they're edible. And stomach ulcers and stomach complaints in general are helped by taking charcoal. That's why I like burnt toast. If my friends have smoke alarms, I always seem to set them off, trying to bring my toast up to a healthy balance of brown and black. These bashings were all too frequent on the railway. Sometimes, if a whole gang was suspected of slacking, we'd be lined up and the Japanese would walk along, slapping each of us in turn. But they treated their own men no better. Once, when we were on a fatigue in a Japanese camp, we saw 14 privates who'd misbehaved themselves. I think they'd gone out without their ground sheets. They were lined up, 7 aside, facing each other, and at a word from the sergeant began to slap each other's faces. If the sergeant thought that one of them was not in earnest, he'd pull him away and show him how face-slapping really should be done. Naturally, we found all this quite entertaining. I must say here that I came across no case of sadism. I've heard stories of it, and I can well believe them, because in war, ghastly things are done on all sides. But the cases of harsh treatment or cruelty that I came across were always for a reason. If they bashed us, it was because they reckoned we could work harder. Someone once pointed out to me a big Korean guard, most of the lower-rank guards were Koreans, who'd beaten a man to death the day before, and it made my flesh creep just to look at him. But apparently he'd done it because he thought the man had stolen something. One day, cholera, that scourge of the undernourished, struck the camp. The first man to get it died within 4 hours of reporting sick. Quite suddenly, the whole atmosphere of the camp changed. You can laugh off the Japanese, you can laugh off hunger, but you can't laugh off cholera. It was almost as though death in person had come into our midst and was claiming his victims. Fit men would be changed to skin and bone overnight. No one was safe. Some people scalded their eating utensils in the fire till they grew too hot to hold and yet went down. Other people didn't seem to bother and came through unscathed. I can't remember doing much myself about it, and apart from a jungle sore on my ankle, I was relatively fit. It was about this time that it came to me very strongly one day that I really had the faith. Our faith seemed to me quite invincible, indestructible. And I remember thinking that if every church and cathedral in the world were to be destroyed, there would be no problem in putting them all up again. It was around this time, too, that the thought entered my head that I might perhaps die there. As I said, we had cholera in the camp, and I think about half of us died in that 1 month. Well, the proximity of death seemed quite pleasant. We know we're always in God's hands, but when you're close to death, you almost get the feel of his fingers. During those days, the world seemed to have a special charm. As I walked out to the cutting, the trees in the forest looked somehow different, as the school buildings looked somehow different on the morning of my last day at school. I felt I might be seeing them for the last time. But now, of course, when we got back to the camp at night, we had the added task of burying those who had died during the day. What saved me, perhaps, from getting cholera was the fact that I'd never had malaria. Malaria leaves you very weak. While you have it, you lose all your appetite, and in those days, of course, there was always someone happy to eat your dinner for you. But when you started feeling better, there wasn't the food you needed to build you up again. Post-malarial inanition was, I believe, often given as the cause of death. Though I heard that one doctor simply put down starvation, but he had to change it. Anyhow, I never got malaria, and used to imagine my guardian angel like a fighter pilot shooting down the Anopheles mosquitoes as they came in to attack me. I later heard that the dengue fever, which I'd had in the early days of our captivity, and which knocks you out completely for about 4 days, immunizes you against malaria. But I still like to give the credit to my guardian angel. In this camp, I was once caught out by trying to be too clever. It was the monsoon period, and every evening for a few minutes the rain simply poured down. It would suddenly start, and after a tremendous downpour would suddenly stop. Since it was always around the same time, I got the great idea that I'd have a shower under the water that poured off the top of our tent. So that evening I was all ready, soap in hand. Suddenly the heavens opened, and in a flash I was under the water shooting off the tent. I soaked myself and soaped myself up as quickly as I could, but before I could get back out of the water, the rain suddenly stopped. When I'm having my morning shower and find myself hoping there won't be a power cut till I've finished, I think it must be due to that experience. We had no anesthetics or indeed doctors in that camp, but we did have some medical orderlies. I remember one called Nicholas. He was an Indian and a Catholic, and he was outstanding in that he went and lived with the cholera patients to look after them and be with them when they died. And of course, they mostly did die. In fact, I knew only one man who didn't. He was a Norfolk farmer, not tall, but very solidly built with a barrel of a chest. He was hairy, too, with hair on his shoulder blades, so you almost felt like patting him as you passed. Well, the cholera bug was no match for him, and he recovered. What the medical orderly did, apparently, when men got cholera, was to sharpen a thin piece of bamboo, stick it into a vein, and pour in a saline solution. This prevented total dehydration, because when you have cholera and go to the loo, it's like water that comes pouring out. They said that when they started looking more like weak cocoa, it meant you were getting better. One evening, when we got back from the cutting, we heard there was a priest in the camp. He was a young Australian Maoist father who'd been given permission by the Japanese to travel up and down the line to minister to the troops in the various camps. He was a Father Lionel Marsden, but known to his fellow Maoists as Sam on account of an Australian comedian called Sam Marsden. Father Marsden was always cheerful, never complaining, always ready to help anyone, always a priest. He was indeed as fine a priest as ever you could hope to meet. So when we heard there was a priest in the camp, word was passed round among the Catholics, and after supper we went to one end of the camp where a packing case had been set up to serve for an altar, and where confessions were already being heard. 2 men standing together, talking in whispers, and a group of men sitting or standing more or less out of earshot. When all the confessions had been heard, Mass began. The forest leaves overhead effectually kept out any light there may have been from the moon or stars, but 2 thin candles stuck to the altar with their own wax were sufficient. As I looked at the columns of the trees disappearing into the darkness overhead, and at the faces of my friends intent on the actions of the priest, I thought, St. Peter's in Rome must be very fine, but surely this is what keeps the church going. After Mass was over, and we'd all received Holy Communion, he blew out one of the candles, and in the light of the other started unvesting and packing his things away in his haversack. And while doing this, he gave us one of the best sermons I've ever heard. You may think, he said, that you're having a pretty awful time, but if only you knew how to see it properly, you would realize you're living through one of the most precious times of your life. That's all I remember, but he must have said a good deal more, for he was speaking for several minutes. Next morning he went on his way, looking for the next camp up the line, and we went out to work, more ready now perhaps, to let God fill up in our bodies those things that were wanting to the sufferings of Christ. Father Marsden was really like a living miracle. No one knew where he slept. No one knew at a time when almost every spoonful was counted how he ate. We heard that he received many bashings from the Japanese. I cannot look back on his memory without emotion, as I recall his smiling heroism and utter forgetfulness of self. Soon after this, we finished the main work of the cutting and were given a day's holiday, the first we'd had since coming to Siam. Most of us celebrated it by going down to the river and having a wash, because so far washing had been done mostly out of mess tins. I used to have a very good all-over wash myself, using simply a mug with water, of course, and an old handkerchief. While we were standing there in the river, the man next to me said, "Hey, chum, you wash my back and I'll wash yours." And as I washed his back, I thought, this is really life in the raw. One poor man, I remember, dropped his soap in the river, and Kelly got a great shock on this day, because he hadn't seen his legs for 6 weeks, or at any rate hadn't noticed them, having worked and slept in the same old pair of sacks, and he came up from the river horrified at how thin they had got. Next day we went back to the cutting to work on an embankment, but soon afterwards I had to report sick and came off work owing to the jungle sore I had on my ankle. Let me tell you something about these jungle sores, which afflicted many of us. You start off with a cut or graze or some break in your skin. Then a bug of some sort gets in and starts eating away your flesh. So the wound gradually grows, with a sort of green scum on top. If it's not treated, it will just keep growing. One man in our camp got lost on his way to the cutting at night, and only after 3 days did he find his way back to us, but by then he already had a huge jungle sore. Another poor fellow had nearly the whole of his shin laid bare, and I heard that he turned over where he lay, and his leg broke, and he died. I heard of 3 ways of curing jungle sores. The best way was to have the rotten flesh cut out. With the bacteria gone, the wound would be able to heal up. But this way was not open to us on the railway, because, as I say, we had no anesthetics and, at least in our camp, no doctors. Another way was to burn the rotten part away with potassium permanganate. They did this with mine later on, but I got up too soon and the wound broke down. Later, in the hospital camp, it was cut out and then healed up. The third way of dealing with jungle sores was the most original. You first of all take a couple of grubs out of the latrines. These are fat little white grubs that later on turn into bluebottle flies. You place them on the wound and cover it all up with a patch you've cut from a banana leaf. You then stick this down round the edge with latex, which you've taken from the rubber trees. Then you leave it all for 3 or 4 days. When you take off the banana leaf dressing, you find that the grubs have eaten the bacteria that were giving all the trouble. The wound is now red and healthy. The grubs have cleaned up all the infection, and you could now tip them back into the latrines. Towards the end of our stay in this camp, we had an enormous amount of meat. It happened like this. We were really fortunate in having the Australians with us, because besides being very good company, they were marvelously enterprising. Whether they stole them or found them roaming loose in the forest, I never knew, but they began coming back from the cutting, driving 2 or 3 bullocks in front of them. The Japanese winked at this, and soon small parties of Australians were going out, bringing back 9 or 10 bullocks at a time. Although we ate them as quickly as we could, and of course the Japanese took all the best cuts, we soon had a herd of 50 or so corralled at one end of the camp. It was encouraging just to go and look at them and feel that one was not right at the bottom of the scale of creation. The meat was very tough, and many people's digestion could not stand the strain, and they had to content themselves with the gravy. One day, I thought I'd make myself some oxtail soup. So I got half a dozen of these bullock's tails from the cookhouse and stood them up in a 4-gallon petrol tin, our usual cooking utensil. They looked like bicycle bumps. I thought a sort of oxtail essence would flow down the inside of the tails into the water, but it didn't work out like that. After half an hour of boiling, it still looked like dirty water, so I threw it all away. Although I never learned how to make oxtail soup, I think I learned a lot of other things during those months we spent working on this cutting. To see men under such extreme conditions is to see almost the very roots of their character. Some men show themselves to be true heroes. Others turn out to be less heroic. I remember a Gurkha major whom I never got to know, but who always struck me as being a man of steel. I felt sure he was a man you could cheerfully trust with your life, and who would never let you down. And I remember a New York Jew called Stanley Wilbur. I fancy his ship had been torpedoed, and he'd been landed at Singapore from a German submarine. One day, seeing my jungle saw, he gave me a new bandage, still in its hygienic wrapping. Now, in those circumstances, he could have sold that bandage for a lot of money and bought himself food, but he gave it to me as though it were mere nothing. I met various Americans during our time of captivity, and generosity seems to be one of their national characteristics. There was another American in our party called Pearl, whom I thought remarkable. Pearl was his surname. He was slightly built and had the air of a dilettante, always with a joke on his lips in a deprecating, modest way. He didn't seem to take anything very seriously, and he stayed just the same right through the very worst days, always cheerful, always ready to help. There was only one sad case of meanness that I remember, when someone went to get a sick man's dinner for him, and on the way back made adjustments to the helpings to his own advantage. I heard that the poor man who did this died later when he himself fell sick. People do indeed vary greatly. I think a lot must depend on their upbringing. Some people are brought up to admire the boy who stood on the burning deck whence all but he had fled, and some people aren't. They think him plain stupid. I noticed this during the fighting. People you admired in England seem different when the shells are dropping, and people you never thought much of at home show themselves rock solid when things go wrong. I suppose the moral of all this is that we should try never to judge anyone. We don't know their strengths, and we don't know our own weaknesses. Although the Japanese paid us from time to time, by far the greater part of our income, both now and throughout our captivity, came from the sale of our possessions. People who began their prison life with a reasonable amount of clothing and equipped with the usual accessories of watch, fountain pen, cigarette lighter, and so on, ended it with no more than they stood up in. Everything that could be sold was sold. Clothes, shoes, bedding, wedding rings. People were even selling the gold fillings from their teeth. But I remember one poor fellow in our party who had a gold cigarette case his wife had given him that he could not bring himself to sell, and he died. I've often thought of that. Unhappily, a too great love of our possessions can lead us to lose more than our earthly life. When people had no more to sell, they took to stealing from the Japanese. I heard of some men who'd been beaten to death for selling tools to the natives. People who made money in this way would pass it on to others less enterprising against checks and IOUs made out for English pounds. The rate of exchange in such transactions varied, but it worked out so that a pound of potatoes would cost, nearly a week's salary, or even more. So we were paying dearly for our survival. I don't know how many of these IOUs were honored on our return home. My bank manager asked me if he should pay the checks I'd signed, but I saw no reason why he shouldn't. Still, a good American friend, Dennis Rowland, returned my check to me, torn up. When they had no more to sell, and there was no chance of taking things from the Japanese, a few men took to stealing things from their comrades. Later on, when I'd returned to Singapore, this reached serious proportions, but here in Siam there were so many men dying that there was little temptation to steal from the living. Sometimes the hospital orderly would come round to see how a patient was faring, only to find him lying dead and stark naked, all his possessions having been taken from him. One thing I learnt during this time was that poverty brings its own reward. People who carried a lot of gear around with them were forever fearful of thieves or of the next move, or worried about their diminishing resources. People who had no more than they stood up in seemed more light-hearted. When the cutting and all the work connected with it had been finally finished, our camp closed down. A small party of fit men went further up the line to join another camp, and the rest of us went downriver by barge to a hospital camp. Our arrival at this hospital camp is among my happiest memories of the war. To be able to lie on the bamboo floor of a hospital hut and feel that you are safe at last, safe from being suddenly called out on some killing fatigue, safe so that you could sleep and sleep and sleep. It seemed that the world could offer us nothing more desirable. We called that camp Cambury, but I think this may have been our abbreviation for a longer name. Father Marsden had come down to the hospital camp with us. He knew there would be plenty of work for him there, and I expected, too, that he must have felt very weak from his continual trekking up and down the railway line in search of his scattered flock. He said Mass early every morning in the little operating theatre. This was the screened-off end of one of the long hospital huts. For his altar, he used the operating table. This was made of bamboo and measured about 7 foot by 30 inches. Apart from the attap leaves, which we used for the roof, bamboo was our only building material. Not that we ourselves had built these hospital huts. The Japanese must have got the local natives to put them up for us. By now, my jungle saw was about 4 inches across, and since we had anesthetics in the camp, and also some surgeons, one of them, Dr. Kevin Fagan, decided to cut out the infected part. I was the first man in that day, and as I lay there on the operating table, I thought to myself, who was last lying here? And I realized it had been our blessed Lord. And what was he doing? Offering himself to the Father for my sins and the sins of the world. So I tried to borrow his thoughts while I waited for the anesthetic. After the operation, I still had this large wound, but it was now a healthy red colour. However, I was still very weak and needed more than our rations to build myself up. So I sold my watch and began to eat eggs. 10 or 12 eggs a day was my usual diet, and slowly the wound began to close up. Every day there'd be a millimetre or so of new flesh round the edge of the wound. It was marvellous to watch it. The eggs were duck eggs and were green inside and smelt of rotten fish, because the ducks, we understood, were fed off rotten fish, but they were eggs, and they saved my life. Or perhaps I should say that my watch did. It had been a 21st birthday present, a really providential gift. Later, when I thanked Dr. Fagan for what he'd done, he just smiled and said, "Don't thank me, thank the Lord." After the war in the seminary, when I was trying to understand the doctrine of the mystical body and the intercession of the saints, I remembered those eggs. In Siam, I put eggs into one end of myself, into my mouth, and right down at the other end, on my ankle, a wound began to heal. This marvel helped me see that our prayers in England can indeed help someone in New Zealand, or even in purgatory, and the prayers of the saints in their glory can also help us poor sinners on earth. It's the mystery of living organisms, whether of our own bodies or of the mystical body of Christ. The anesthetic, I may say, didn't always work, and I was told of one of the surgeons in our camp, a cheerful Irishman, who came in one day and saw one of his friends lying there on the operating table. To encourage him, he said, "You know, this is going to be a real triumph of mind over matter. I don't mind and you don't matter." But the anesthetic was a great boon. Up in the jungle, the surgeons, to keep the patient still during the operation, had to choose their orderlies for their weight and strength. But now a man could have his ulcers cut out painlessly and get a good night's sleep into the bargain. There was a man in the camp at this time, I remember, who had a great abscess at the base of his spine. The surgeon watched its progress, and when it was judged ripe, fixed the operation for 5 o'clock one evening. But solvitur ambulando, as they say. That same morning, the unfortunate man, coming out of his hut, slipped in the mud and landed flat on his back, so the operation was not needed. But although we had anesthetics for operations, there was a great shortage of the kind needed to give a man in constant pain a night's sleep. However, there was a Dutch soldier in the camp who could do this in a way no one could understand. He was a Jew, and his first name was Hercules. I forget his surname, but I got such a kick out of saying, "Good morning, Hercules," that I'd go out of my way to greet him, and so we became acquainted. His name belied his appearance, though, for he had a wretched physique, but he had a fine head and strong dark brown eyes, and he could somehow draw pain from people. He'd stand by the patient, with his hand outstretched to the affected part, as though we were warming his hands to the wound, and slowly the pain would go, and then Hercules could send the patient to sleep by, I think, ordinary hypnotic means. He found the process very exhausting, and was able to do it only a few times a day. I saw him at work once on a big Dutch officer whose legs were paralyzed, and Hercules had been sent along to see what he could do. He was standing by the bed, tense, his eyes half closed, the veins on his forehead visible, his hands outstretched and quivering by the Dutchman's feet, who, by way of contrast, was leaning back, greatly at his ease, smoking a cheroot. I forget what the outcome was. One day we heard that Hercules was sick, and soon after that he died. I don't know what his religious practice had been, but I'm sure our Lord must have treated very gently one who took on himself so readily the sufferings of others. There was also a Dutch doctor in the camp, a Eurasian, whose Christian name was Napoleon, and as I had him for a friend too, I felt I was moving in very distinguished circles. About the greatest consolation I had at this time was eating. Eggs were only 10 cents each, and as I'd sold my watch for $250, I was able to eat, as I've said, a great many. People often didn't bother to cook them, but just beat them up raw with sugar or lime juice or bananas. As we didn't wear much, there was a camp order soon after our arrival forbidding men to go around naked. We were able to see our bodies putting on flesh. We were indeed very thin when they arrived at the camp from the railway. I remember looking at one man and thinking that I could almost hang my hat on his hip bone sticking out. And one poor fellow said to the doctor, "Doctor, I've got a lump in my stomach. I can feel something hard sticking up." The doctor felt him and said, "Oh, you needn't worry about that. That's just your backbone." So we really looked forward to our meals. And this reminds me of one of my happiest memories. It was soon after my operation, and I'd been woken up by a clatter at the far end of the hut, and the cry of the orderlies, "Breakfast up." I lay drowsily where I was, thinking agreeable thoughts about food, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Father Marsden. "Have you broken your fast?" "No, Father." He took the pyx from his pocket, gave me Holy Communion, and was gone. I lay down again. What a God we have. When we can't go to Holy Communion to him, he must needs come to us. I believe the French have a saying, "Il y a un qui baise et un qui tend la joue." There is one who kisses and one who puts out their cheek to be kissed, meaning that in marriage there is always one who loves more than the other. Well, in the relationship between God and ourselves, there's no doubt who loves the more. Another time, when I was lying there after my operation, a rat ran over my chest. You might not think it, but even though they run so quickly, rats grip with their claws at every step they take. They're very thorough creatures. On another occasion, I was able to watch an insect that had landed on me. It was just having a rest, and I was able to look at it for a minute or two. It was less than an inch long, but delicate and very beautiful, with fluffy yellow tufts on the ends of its antennae. I thought how God must enjoy making such an elegant creature, and in a place where there was so little to please the eye, it was a joy to see it. When I was up and about, the commanding officer of the camp asked me to start a shaving club. He was Major Marsden, senior medical officer and brother of our Father Marsden. The men in the camp were the ones who had survived those months on the railway, and their only interest now was on staying alive and building up their strength. They weren't bothered much about how they looked, but Major Marsden reckoned that if everyone was shaved, it would help morale. Most people had sold all their shaving tackle by this time, but we managed to buy a few open razors and engaged some barbers who went round the camp shaving the patients as they lay in bed. In Australia, before the war, it seems, they used to have shaving competitions to see who could shave people quickest. I suppose they must have disqualified anyone who drew blood, otherwise it would have been too terrifying for the man in the chair. One of the champion shavers was in our camp now, and it was amazing to see him at work. He seemed just to wave his razor around the man's face, and the lather and stubble would disappear under your eyes. To while away the hours, we used to have many quizzes in the evenings, and I almost got to the point of knowing who won the Melbourne Cup in 1932. I learned, too, that you don't pronounce Melbourne, but Melbourne. Because of the shortage of books, some people also read aloud to the patients. But I can remember doing this myself for only about a week. It was a short thriller, and I was reading it to 12 men screened off at the end of a hut. It was an exciting book, and it turned out at the end that the person you'd been suspecting all along hadn't done the crime, but someone who'd been thought quite innocent. but 7 men had died before we learnt this. However, I found myself not only feeling no sympathy for them, but rather feeling almost irritated that they'd obviously not been listening. The excitement of the story should have been enough, I thought, to keep anyone alive. And anyhow, they died thinking the wrong person had done it. I suppose that with so much death on all sides, my sensibilities have become dulled. Many people did indeed die in that camp, and Father Marsden was kept busy. Because I was now relatively fit and moving around a good deal to see how the shaving club was going, one of the non-Catholic chaplains asked me to ask his men, if they were dying, whether they'd like to see him. This showed me how blessed we were with our sacramental system for getting into heaven. If one of our men was dying and had been away from his religion for half a lifetime, Father Marsden, in 2 minutes, would have got him back safely into the arms of God and ready to meet him. One of our doctors told me of a rather horrifying experience he'd had. He'd put out a few bodies for burial, and as he walked past them, he saw there were more than he'd put out. So he went over them one by one and found that one man was still alive. The poor man was so wearied of life and had so lost all hope that he laid himself out with his 8 comrades to join them in their common grave. People varied a great deal in the face of death. Our own people and the Australians would put up a great fight to live. But some men, I was told, would take off their ring and give it to a friend to return to their family, and just go into the hospital and die. Tobacco was more easily available now, and this made a great difference to the smokers. In the early days in Singapore, people had resorted to smoking tea leaves and dried cherry leaves. Later, they learnt that the tomato and the eggplant belonged to the same general family as the tobacco plant, so people used these leaves to eke out the little tobacco they were able to buy. I've just looked up eggplant in my dictionary, and there's no mention of it, so perhaps his real name was something else, but anyhow, that was what we called it. I think there must be something in us that enjoys calling things by names we've made up. That was the prerogative that God gave Adam. We had an Australian in the camp who had a long German name we couldn't manage. However, he was heavily built and had low, beetling brows, so we called him Darwin, thinking he might be the missing link. When the time came for us all to go home, he was going round everyone saying, "Hey, chum, stop calling me Darwin. What will a girlfriend think?" To get back to our smokers. Here in Kamburi, villagers would come to the camp selling tobacco, and this cheered our smokers up like nothing else could. It met their most pressing need. For some people, I think, the biggest anxiety of all those prison years was wondering where the next smoke would come from. Smoking seemed to relieve their hunger better than food could, and I've known starving men exchange their rations for a smoke. There must have been not a few who thus smoked themselves into their graves. They gave away their mortal life just for a whiff of smoke, and sadly, of course, some people seem to prefer pleasures equally insubstantial and fleeting to their unique and immortal life. Perhaps I ought to apologize for all this sermonizing. My excuse is that years of musing over those prison experiences have perhaps led me to see them more in the light of eternity than of this world. And when you get old, as I am now, you realize that whether you like it or not, you'll soon be seeing everything in that light. We'd heard that we should be returning to Singapore as soon as the railway was finished, and at last, after 9 months in Siam, the order came for the move south. There was great rejoicing, mitigated somewhat by news of the food shortage that prevailed there. So we crammed ourselves into the iron trucks again, and we rattled our way southwards through Siam. The train ran through huge forests, between rice fields so extensive you could almost see the curvature of the earth, through what looked like parkland, where we saw elephants grazing, and at last we crossed the frontier and came into Malaya. It seemed like home. The hills and the trees looked no different. The sky was the same. We were still at the back of beyond, but we felt that we were at last on a bit of the map that was marked red. We felt that an exile had ended. Our train reached Singapore in the middle of the night, but we hadn't long to wait before lorries turned up to take us to our new camp. The moon was nearly full, and as we drove through the deserted streets of the city and saw so many reminders of our own past, our spirits rose. Lately, our status had been no higher than that of a beast of burden. But now we remembered that we were men of a certain culture, and there were more things in life than struggling for survival in a cholera-ridden jungle. When we reached the old Air Force camp that was to be our home, we found again with delight the mechanical obedience of modern plumbing. In Siam, we'd had to fetch water from the well or carry it up from the river, and even then we'd had to boil it before we dared drink it. But here we could just turn the tap and be waited on by the force of gravity. When we dumped our kit, most of us made straight for the showers. The cool, clean water drumming down on us seemed to do more than remove dirt and sweat. It seemed to restore to us our dignity as men, a dignity that had almost been forgotten through our having to live so long like animals. And as we lay down to sleep that night on the concrete floor, we felt that if it was hard, at least it was civilized, and as such was a welcome change from the native-fashion bamboo floors that we'd been used to. It cannot have been long, I think, before we were moved up to Changi Jail, the officers being in huts outside the jail and most of the other ranks inside. As at the beginning of our captivity, they broke up in this way the unity of our regiments. Sensible from their point of view, but an unhappy situation for us. As we had been warned, food here was in short supply, and there were no obliging natives coming to the camp to sell us eggs at 10 cents each. But the less food there was, the more skilled our cooks became. Banana skin pie, for instance, when they put banana skins into the rice to give it all a slight banana flavor. And to counter the lack of calcium in our diet, they collected all eggshells and crushed them into powder, and roasted all fish bones and ground them down too, and then added it all to our rice. Even so, I remember, my teeth became loose, though perhaps this was due to our having nothing much to chew on. Meat, if I remember rightly, was entirely lacking in our diet. However, some enterprising souls found snails, and by dint of long cooking and massive flavoring with pepper or chili, ate them with apparent pleasure. And of course any cats that wandered into our camp soon disappeared into someone's cooking pot. Rats, I was told, could be bought at, well, the equivalent of several days' pay. There was a little sea captain who turned up in the camp at this time. I don't know where he came from. I think the seamen who were with us were all survivors from ships sunk by German submarines. But this new arrival had a small white terrier, which the Germans could scarcely have taken on board. So maybe he wasn't a sea captain after all. But anyhow, he had this stout little terrier, which he led everywhere with him on a short rope. But alas, war is a terrible thing, and one night that little dog disappeared. I think it was at this time, too, that some Australians really excelled themselves. They were working on some job outside the camp, and every day an Indian would drive a herd of bullocks past where they were working. Well, the Australians hadn't eaten meat for months, and this was more than flesh and blood could endure. Some people really crave for meat. My friend Dennis Rowland told me that for months after his release, he couldn't bat a dog without drooling at the mouth. So one day, the Australians dug a pit, covered it with branches and grass, and waited for the Indian and his herd of cattle. As they came past, they grabbed the last beast, killed it, skinned it, cut off all the best joints, and handed them out to the boys, threw the skin and carcass down into the pit, and covered it up again with branches and grass. So when the poor Indian came running back 10 minutes later, the Australians were all hard at work, and scarcely looked up when he asked them if anyone had seen a stray cow. To provide salt for cooking, as I've said, men in working parties by the sea would bring back buckets of seawater. Some of the more enterprising prisoners would boil this seawater down to provide salt crystals, which they would sell. They'd found that the metal spring in the chin strap of a steel helmet makes an excellent resistance wire for cooking, so they would tap the camp electricity supply and leave their cans of seawater boiling all night. I don't think the Japanese ever discovered where all their electric power was going. Some people, I remember, grew garlic and ate plenty of it. If you stood downwind from them, you could tell they were simply reeking with it. Other people would buy chicks and build up a chicken farm. It's amazing how people differ. If everyone in the world was started off at exactly the same level, in a week or two, some, by sheer brains and industry, would already be far ahead of the others. We all started off in the same boat, but after 3 years of captivity, some people were relatively affluent and eating well, while others were barely surviving. But the unpleasant side of this was that a man who'd done well for himself could sit down to enjoy half a chicken for his dinner, opposite a colleague who had only the basic rice issue on his plate, and appear not to notice the difference. We were short of everything in this camp. Smokers used sun-dried tomato leaves wrapped in newspaper, and after a time they could imagine this was like real tobacco. For coffee, we would roast rice till it was black, grind it down with a bottle on a hard surface, sweeten it with plenty of the local brown sugar, and drink it hot. It was black, it was sweet, it was hot. We just tried to overlook the fact that it was not coffee. When we arrived in our camp, we found sleeping huts, a cookhouse, and a medical store already built. I fancy our commanding officer was able to negotiate with the Japanese for a hut to be built to serve as a library. In all our camps, there were books available on loan to those who wished. I remember Father Aidan Jackson told me that he would always inspect the books in any camp he went to, slip into his coat pocket any he deemed dangerous, and drop them down a borehole. Deep boreholes in the sand served as our lures. In that environment, books on witchcraft, for instance, or pornography, could do a lot of harm. However, in every camp, we would always try to build some sort of chapel. So we soon got together and decided on an unused site just beyond our sleeping quarters. It was a small sandy slope, and I'd wanted to have the altar at the top, so we'd look up to it. But the others said it would be better at the bottom, and as it turned out, this was by far the better arrangement. Building this little chapel was a great joy for many people. The designer and builder was Hamish Cameron Smith, an architecture student from Glasgow, but many others helped him by collecting the materials. Men on working parties down in Singapore would bring back a tile under their shirt. For the roof rafters, one man would decide he was ill and needed to be carried back to the camp on a stretcher, which his friends would make for him from timber lying handy. For the walls, I went round the houses in the camp where some of us were billeted and took down the metre-square white boarding from the ceilings. Thus, many people collected all we needed for the chapel, but Hamish was the sole creator of what turned out to be a real work of art. He designed it all in his head and put in every nail himself. He was the architect, the works manager, and the builder. My task was to straighten out nails for him, saw along his pencil lines, and be his odd job man. When it was finished, we found we needed drains to prevent the rainwater off the roof washing away the sand, and I noticed some large concrete drains outside the Japanese guardhouse. So I told Father Marsden that I'd take them while the guards were having their dinner. He thought I should first tell Father Dolan, our senior chaplain, but I said that if I were caught, it would be far better if the priests knew nothing about it. He gave me a mock, scornful look and said, "You ought to be a Jesuit." Anyhow, I did get the drains. We still needed to make some sort of nave for our chapel, and this is where a young Dutch lieutenant, Herman Meyer, stepped in and took charge. He was really a very gifted young man and decided to turn the sandy slope into a fan-shaped nave with a rows going down by 6-inch steps. To prevent the rain washing the steps away, we covered their edges with turf. There was a tennis court in the camp that was surfaced with the fine red gravel that we used to have on tennis courts before the war. Herman worked out what cubic footage of this we'd need and got us all to scrape this red gravel off the surface of the court until we had enough. With this, he covered the floor of the nave. Then he got us to put bits of planking on 6-inch posts between the steps. These served as kneelers for the people behind or seats for the people in front. I must mention another name in this building work, though indeed there were many of us. This was Roy French, who put all his strength and enthusiasm into the work. Indeed, he really put in too much, because this and our general malnutrition led him to lose his sight, and he went completely blind. I heard that after the war he convalesced in South Africa, married, and with the help of his wife, trained for physiotherapy. The courage that saw him through his prison years enabled him to cope with the years that followed. Because no one else wanted the job, I became the chapel gardener, and soon saw we needed a perimeter fence for the nave to separate it from the rest of the camp. Someone had told me that if you put a hibiscus branch in the ground it grows, so I reckoned we'd need a hibiscus hedge. Unfortunately, the cookhouse fires had already claimed all the hibiscus hedges in the camp except for one, and that was at the end of the camp commandant's garden. So I went there one morning, armed with my blunt saw, and cut it down. He came out onto his veranda and watched me doing it. Perhaps he wondered who on earth had told this man to cut his hedge down, but he did nothing. If you're dressed for the part and look unconcerned, it's amazing what you can get away with. A man in a boiler suit should walk right through a hospital ward and into the day room, unplug the television set with a murmur about replacing it, and walk out with it, and no one says a word. So I was able to walk off with that poor man's hibiscus hedge, but not having green fingers, the ones I put in all died. Looking back now, I wonder how I had the nerve to do such a thing. It must have been that the successful building of our chapel made us all feel so confident we felt we'd get away with anything. With the hibiscus hedge a total failure, Herman Meyer again came to our help and constructed a decorative barbed wire fence. He designed a semicircle of wire with the ends about 1 meter apart. He then hammered little stakes into the ground about 50 centimeters apart to form an elliptical perimeter to the nave. Then he tied the ends of the wires to the stakes and tied the wires together where they crossed. Then, in place of the failed hibiscus hedge, he planted what I think was a sort of convolvulus, which we called Morning Glory, because the purple trumpet-shaped flowers lasted only a day, or else mile a minute because it grew so rapidly. Next to the chapel on either side, we grew red and white canna lilies. We had no real soil there at all. It was just sand, leached by the heavy rains. But, and I've not seen this in any gardening book, human urine mixed with 2 parts water makes excellent fertilizer for flowers and green vegetables. So every evening I put a 4-gallon petrol tin outside our hut to save men trekking up to the urinals, and first thing every morning I collect it, fill it up at the taps, and go and water our flowers. So we had a lovely garden. In fact, what with the beauty of Hamish's chapel and the harmonious layout of Herman's nave, and of course the presence of our Lord himself in the tabernacle, the chapel was a real oasis of quiet and consolation for many people. To have our Lord himself in the camp with us just made all the difference. Mick Moylan was Father Marsden's batman, and he used to spend most of the day praying there, kneeling with his head cocked on one side. Father Marsden said he didn't know whether Mick was going round his rosary or the rosary was going round Mick, but he certainly prayed a great deal. It was he who taught me how to say the rosary. We also got people to make rosaries. People out on working parties would bring in little hard berries they'd found on bushes. Some of the berries were oval, red and black in colour, and others were more heart-shaped and a bright red. They then bored thin holes through these. My job was to find electrical wire and strip it down for them to thread through the berries. A carpenter made little wooden crosses, and someone else made the figure out of printer's metal cast in a mould made of plaster of Paris provided by the camp dentist. We made over 200 of these rosaries. Let me say something more about Hamish. He had very ginger hair and always had to go round with a towel over his shoulders to prevent sunburn. He was utterly unselfish. We paid a monthly mess sub to supplement the meager rations the Japanese gave us, and when Hamish had paid his sub, he would spend the rest on tobacco and fancy food to give to patients in the sick bay. This sick bay was out of bounds to the rest of the camp because of the TB and other ailments people had there. But Hamish never bothered much about rules, and he used to go there regularly. Officers weren't allowed into the main jail either, but when Hamish had finished our chapel, he built a second one inside the jail for the men there. One day, as he was going in, with his towel over his shoulders, and his face and chest probably flecked with green paint, we were then painting our chapel, the sentry stopped him and said, "Aren't you an officer?" Hamish looked at him and said in his ripest Glasgow accent, "I ask you, do I look like an officer?" Towards the very end of our captivity, he fell sick himself with TB. This was a great shock to us. I wrote, "Catholic action's best support, doing all our Saviour taught, couldn't do it on the ration, got a job with Catholic passion." But happily no obituary was needed. He recovered in Zambia, where he went after the war for convalescence, and where he's been practicing as an architect ever since. But let me finish the story of our chapel. Max Lee was an Australian corporal who volunteered at the end of the war to help the Australian War Graves Unit. He went with his unit along the route of the railway, exhuming bodies from rough graves or gathering them where they lay, and taking them to the Memorial Cemetery in Singapore. Later, he was put in charge of a work party to burn down our prison camp. I now quote from an Australian newspaper article dated 25th of January 1997. Quote, "He found among the hundreds of roughly built huts 5 different places of worship, 4 Christian and 1 Jewish. One particular chapel, in remarkably good condition, moved the young soldier deeply. Something about the simple, sturdy structure, standing in a carefully tended garden, symbolized the struggle of all those thousands of prisoners who clung to the belief that beyond the immediate horrors of the war, there was a God who loved them. Beside it was a rough inscription. This chapel is dedicated to Our Lady Help of Christians, and in memory of our deceased comrades who died in Malaya, the Netherlands East Indies, Thailand and Burma, over whose remains there was no Christian symbol. Max was later able to meet hundreds of prisoners of war from Changi, of every faith and some with no formal religion, who told them they would go to the chapel every night to pray. End of quote. When his Japanese prisoners were about to set fire to our chapel, Max stopped them and asked the British Commission for permission to send the building to the War Museum in Canberra. Permission was granted, and he had the chapel dismantled and crated up and sent back to Australia. There, the crates were put in store and forgotten about, but came to light again in 1987 as they were preparing for Australia's bicentenary celebrations. They decided to re-erect the chapel as a memorial to all their prisoners of war, and it was rededicated at 2:30 in the afternoon on August 15th, 1988, the same date and time that news reached Changi that the war was over. Hamish and I could not be there, but the following year we flew out and I offered Mass in the chapel, the first Mass that had been offered in it since the days of our captivity. Let me go back now to go on with our life in Changi in the last months of our captivity. Both here and up in Siam, we'd had many cases of beriberi. This is brought on by vitamin B deficiency. So when the Japanese found some old sacks of rice polishings, they passed them on to us. Every day we'd queue up and receive 2 spoonfuls of what looked like sawdust, but was nevertheless apparently full of vitamin B. Unfortunately, weevils had got there first, so when we poured water into the mug to drink it down, these little creatures would come to the top and start swimming around. I first thought of picking them out, but there were too many of them, and anyhow, they were probably full of proteins and so on, so I just stirred them all in and drank them down, standing over a drain, I remember, in case I brought them up. Food really was in short supply. Nevertheless, some people talked about it incessantly. They talked about what they ate before the war, what they'd eat when they got home, how our present diet could be improved. And if it wasn't food they were talking about, it was women. With little food in the camp and of course no women, nevertheless, food and women seemed to be all their talk. We said their conversation never rose above their navels. However, there were others whose conversation was more positive, and I especially remember Reggie Burton's evening chat shows. Reggie Burton was a captain in the Norfolks. He was a regular and came of an army family, and he could chat away effortlessly and amusingly for hours on end. His whole leisurely manner of speaking was such that you sat there in happy expectation of his next amusing comment on life. Evening after evening, we'd sit around him, trying to stay within earshot, while he carried on his light-hearted and perhaps nonsensical chat with the people in his immediate vicinity. He was never bitter or offensive or personal, and his chat shows gave us much relief from the harshness of our daily lives. We were all much in his debt. There were others, too, who were real heroes, in that they not only helped us all, but risked their lives in doing so. They were the people who got us the news. They'd somehow assembled radio sets and hidden them. I never knew where, neither did I inquire who they were, but we were all grateful for what they did. While someone kept a watch out in case a guard might be coming, they'd listen to the news from India or Australia, and then pass it on to 2 or 3 others. Each of these in their turn would pass it on to others, so that in an hour the whole camp would know what was happening in the war. The Japanese, I believe, could never find these sources of our news, though they knew we had them. It was around this time that some books came into the camp, and I read the story of St. Ignatius and the early Jesuits. It wasn't long before I, too, decided I want to be a Jesuit. Why? I think the name of the order, Society of Jesus, was the main attraction. But also, all those early Jesuits in England, in South America, in India and Japan, they all seemed to end up as martyrs, and this seemed a good thing. Also, I thought St. Ignatius a leader I could follow. He'd gone from an enthusiastic military life to a period of enforced inactivity while he recovered from his wounds, and from there he went straight into the enthusiastic following of Christ, and that is more or less how I saw my own life. I must not end this narrative without saying how magnificently the Dutch created our vegetable garden out of an arid hillside. They first contoured the whole site, using simply a triangle of sticks and a plumb line. They then dug channels along the contour lines a yard apart, with the earth, or rather sand, heaped up in between the channels. The topmost channel was slightly below the level of our showers, so they dug a channel connecting the two. In the evenings, when everyone was taking a shower, a team of men would stand at key points, diverting the water into this channel or that, until, by the time people had finished their showers, the whole area had been irrigated. They then made compost with the help of chicken manure to fertilize the soil. They'd made the desert blossom into a garden. Bullfrogs were a great nuisance to us in the early morning. These bullfrogs, they sit around our huts, and long before we wanted to get up, would start their croaking. One morning, I was being kept awake by a very loud croaking that came from immediately outside the door of our hut. He could have been doing it on purpose just to annoy us, so I got up and went outside to look at him. He had just inflated himself and was about to give us the benefit of his croak, of which he was obviously proud, but I looked him straight in the eye. Insofar as a frog can look guilty, that frog looked guilty. Shame at his unsocial behavior was written all over his face, and he silently deflated and crawled away. But living almost on the equator has its advantages. It's not all bullfrogs and mosquitoes. The moon and the stars at night were much more beautiful than the ones we have at home. The moon would come up between the palm trees, a really massive moon, as big as the trees, and we would watch it slowly climb the sky and move across the heavens. At midnight, we could even read by its light, and every star in the sky seemed to be out on show. The sheer beauty of the night sky was something of a tranquilizer after the stress and anxieties of the day. Towards the end of our captivity, the source of black market wheat flour gradually dried up. When the priests gave us Holy Communion, we could scarcely feel it on our tongues. It was such a tiny fragment, and eventually they had to stop saying Mass altogether. So far as I remember, they kept the real presence in the tabernacle till the end, but in the mornings, instead of Mass, all they could do now was to read us a chapter from the Imitation of Christ. Every month, towards the time of the full moon, we would ask ourselves if this was going to be the month for the Allies' invasion of Malaya. We assumed that this would be how we would eventually be liberated. However, apparently the Japanese had planned to shoot all officers and any other prisoners outside Changi jail as soon as any fighting started in the region. So but for the bomb, I shouldn't be here. Then, in early August, we heard about the atom bomb on Japan, and a few days later of the Emperor's surrender. For people who like that sort of thing, it's interesting to note that we were prisoners for just 3.5 years. That's the duration in Scripture of the times of tribulation. Twice the prophet Daniel, that's in Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 and chapter 12 verse 7, He speaks of a time, 2 times, and half a time as being the duration of a chastisement allowed by God. And in the Apocalypse, St. John twice mentions 42 months as being the length of time allowed, first for the trampling of the holy city, that is chapter 11, verse 2, and then for the reign of the beast, in chapter 13, verse 5. We surrendered on February the 15th, 1942, and the Emperor surrendered on August the 15th, 1945. 3.5 years to the day. So now, we knew that the war was over and we'd won. And of course we knew the Japanese knew, and we knew that they knew that we knew. And they knew that we knew that they knew that we knew it. I'm getting confused. Anyhow, it was a complex situation, resolved, I was told, by a Japanese sergeant who parachuted down with a message for the Japanese commander of the island. He would not believe that the Emperor could surrender, and a member of the imperial family had to be flown out to assure him that this was indeed so. They would now have to surrender the island. During these days of transition, I thought that everyone behaved with commendable restraint. For the most part, we had to stay in the camp and were not allowed down into the city. The Japanese showed a stoic dignity. Except for one case I remember. I very much wanted to get some soap. We'd been using soap made in the camp from palm oil and wood ash, and I longed for something more civilized. So I went to see some sisters. If anyone in Singapore still had real soap, surely it would be the sisters. So I found a convent where there were some Chinese sisters, and I was speaking with one of them when a truck arrived to take away the Japanese soldiers who had occupied half the convent for the past 3 years. The sister broke off what she was saying with, "Oh, they're going," and ran down to say goodbye to them. One young Japanese soldier was so overcome by her kindness that he burst into tears. We were issued with air letter forms so that we'd write home. During the time of our captivity, we had indeed once been given postcards and told that we could write 6 words in capitals, no more, and of course these would be censored to make sure that nothing derogatory was said about the Japanese or the conditions under which we were living. So one man's letter said it all. He wrote, "Food's great, just like Loch Derg." In that first letter home, I told my parents I'd become a Catholic since leaving England, and that in spite of everything, I'd had the happiest 3.5 years of my life. I forget how I tried to explain it, but it would not have been more succinct than King David's, "Thou hast put joy into my heart, more than when corn and wine abound," in Psalm 4. I expect my family thought I got off my head. We had a wonderful voyage home. It was a Polish ship, the Sobieski, and of course we ate and ate. They put weighing machines out, and in the first 15 days I put on 14 pounds. During the voyage we called in Colombo, had a swim in the Red Sea, and saw Gibraltar as we passed. We finally docked at Liverpool. A good lady came home with me all the way to Kent to make sure everything was all right. I suppose there could be cases where the returning soldier might find himself walking into a serious family problem and her presence would be needed. As it was, she just witnessed our wonderful family reunion and withdrew. The first thing I did after getting home was to see my doctor, and he prescribed a course of Guinness and milk. And the second thing I did was to locate the whereabouts of the Jesuits and go to see them. As it happened, I got the address wrong and went to 118 Mount Street, a butcher shop. Edified that the Jesuit provincial should be living over a butcher shop, I inquired where he was. The butcher was deaf and thought I wanted a dentist, but a woman in the shop directed me round the corner to a number 114. Father Martin Darcy, the provincial, received me very kindly, and after chatting with me, sent me round to see 2 other priests. They took me on, fixing a day in mid-January for my entry, and gave me a form for my doctor. At this juncture in my life, I decided to reduce the first part of my surname to its initial letter. My surname is Simon Thwaites, but the sort of priest I wanted to be didn't go around with a double-barreled name. All the same, I think I was wrong, and many times I've regretted what I did. Catholics will put up with almost anything from a priest, as long as he tries to be a real priest and teaches true Catholic doctrine. So it's only when I'm voting, or at the doctor, or using my passport, that I'm able to enjoy my full identity. Anyhow, St. John tells us in the Apocalypse, in chapter 2, that if we make it to heaven, we'll all get a new name, so maybe it's not all that important. I was still on sick leave and on full pay when I went to the noviceship. After 3 months as a novice, I wrote to the pay office and asked if I could perhaps be demobbed. They gave me a date for this, and one day in April, I went to a demobilization center, was given a cheap civilian suit, and officially demobbed. The story that had started in Victoria Station in the first days of September 1939 had now ended. After having a drink with another man who'd also just been demobbed, I returned to my Jesuit novitiate, which I'd already decided was worse than the Japanese POW camps. Thanks be to God that I survived the one and the other and drew great profit from both. Towards the end of my seminary formation, when I was already ordained and had finished the theology course, I wrote the following lines. I was now able to express more clearly what I'd vaguely been feeling during those prison years. I passed 2 lovers in a lane, lovers for all to see. Hand in hand they walked along, they did not notice me. But then I thought, far better off am I, sweet Lord, than they, for they have just these few short hours, but I'm with you all day, and all night too, and all the week, and all the whole year through, and all eternity as well. I'll always be with you. And they were there, just hand in hand, but your embrace of me is closer far than human love can ever hope to be. We have an inward union, the like of which is none. You live in me, and I in you. Our love has made us one. And this our love is pure and chaste. It cannot tire or cloy. A gift divine, it fills my heart with more than human joy. So teach all lovers, Lord, I pray, that while indeed it's true, love reigns supreme, yet teach them this, their first love must be you. Well, that must serve as a conclusion to these rambling reminiscences.